The Trump-Russia investigation and surveillance controversies involved many of the same players around the same time frame, but that report will come later. I want to thank Mr. Horowitz for being here today to speak on these very important topics. I also want to thank Director Wray for moving his schedule around so that he could be with us today. The committee has yet to receive the two non-public sections of the report. One is classified, the other is described as, quote, unquote, law enforcement sensitive. I would appreciate if both of the witnesses here today would work to ensure the committee receive these as soon as possible. The committee also invited former Attorney General Lynch, former FBI Director Comey, and former Director McCabe, Deputy Director McCabe, to testify today. Mr. McCabe's lawyer wrote that his client would rely on his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination to avoid answering any questions here today. Mr. Comey's attorney tells us he is out of the country, although I saw he was in Iowa over the weekend. According to his Twitter feed, he seems to be having a wonderful time. This is the second time since he was fired that Mr. Comey refused an invitation to testify here voluntarily. He has time for book tours and television interviews, but apparently no time to assist this committee, which has primary jurisdiction over the Justice Department. Ms. Lynch also chose not to show up. The need for transparency does not end when senior officials are fired or quit. We changed our rules at the beginning of this Congress to ensure the chairman and ranking member can compel hearing testimony from important witnesses like these. Unfortunately, the ranking member refused to agree to compel any of them to be here today. That's a shame because we should be asking them how all of this happened on their watch. There was some shocking news in the Inspector General's report. Thanks to his work, we already knew about Peter Strzok, Lisa Page, and their anti-Trump text messages. Now, in this report, we learned that at least 3 others at the FBI did the same thing. Got to turn off my phone here. The Inspector General referred all 5 of them for violations of the FBI Code of Conduct. 4 of these 5 FBI employees were on the 15-member team investigating Hillary Clinton. That's more than 25% of that team. 3 of these 5 employees later ended up on the special counsel Mueller's team. If the Inspector General had not discovered their anti-Trump text, they would still be with Mueller's team. They would still be investigating the Trump campaign. They would still be texting about how they despise President Trump and everyone who voted for him. They would still be plotting about how to use their official position to stop him. We just wouldn't know about it. Remember these facts every time you hear the press or my friends on the other side of the aisle claim that this report found no bias. You may hear that talking point a lot today, but don't be fooled. Robert Mueller removed these people from his team. Why did he do that? Obviously, because this kind of political bias has no place in law enforcement. When it was exposed so clearly, Mr. Mueller had no choice. Most of the time, evidence of political bias is not so explicit. The details in this report confirm what American people have suspected for a long time. Hillary Clinton got the kid glove treatment. The contrast to Russia probe is very stark. The biggest difference, of course, is the appointment of a special counsel. Attorney General Lynch refused to appoint one. The appearance of political influence was inevitable. First, political appointees at Justice had a personal financial interest in Clinton victory to keep their jobs. Second, President Obama and his press secretary publicly signaled in April 2016 that Secretary Clinton's actions only amounted to simply this: carelessness. Director Comey and the FBI took their cue from President Obama and picked up the theme. In May, he started drafting his public exoneration, which ultimately called her conduct, quote unquote, extremely careless. Third, Ms. Lynch's ties to the Clintons created an appearance of conflict. She was a partner at a law firm that represented both President and Secretary Clinton. Bill Clinton also appointed her to be the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District, New York. Ms. Lynch met privately with President Clinton days before she agreed with the FBI to close the investigation without any charges. If there were ever a time for a special counsel, this would be that time. Attorney General Lynch clearly should have recused herself, and this lingering controversy proves it. But she refused to step aside, regardless of how bad it looked. Now, by contrast, Attorney General Sessions recused himself, and his deputy, Rod Rosenstein, appointed a hard-charging special counsel. The difference is between night and day. Under Lynch, Comey drafted a public exoneration of Clinton before 17 key witnesses were interviewed. Under Rosenstein, no one seriously thinks Robert Mueller would plan a press conference to exonerate Trump before his investigators' work is done. Under Lynch, a low-level IT worker lied to the FBI twice about destroying records under subpoena and got immunity. Under Rosenstein, a low-level Trump campaign associate provided the wrong date for a conversation with a professor and got charged with lying to the FBI. Under Lynch, Clinton's lawyers and aides who improperly held classified information got carefully crafted agreements to limit searches of their computers by consent. Under Rosenstein, Trump's lawyers and former aides got raided and hauled before grand juries. The Justice Department faces a serious credibility problem because millions of Americans suspect that there is a double standard. They see a story of kid-glove treatment for one side and bare-knuckle tactics for the other. They see politics in that story. But this Inspector General report is only about the first part of that story, the Clinton matter. The report has more shocking details. It wasn't just Hillary Clinton using private email for official business, so was Jim Comey. It wasn't just Andy McCabe talking to the press, so were dozens of others at all levels of the FBI. So many FBI officials had unauthorized contact with the media that the Inspector General couldn't figure out who was leaking. Reporters were plying their FBI sources with tickets to sporting events, meals, drinks, and golf outings. The FBI has managed to promote a culture that winks at unauthorized disclosures to the press, but punishes legally protected whistleblowing. It stiff-arms congressional oversight to hide embarrassing facts, while it leaks self-serving tidbits to friendly reporters bearing gifts. Director Wray has quite a mess to clean up. I think he probably knows that. The department has serious accountability issues. In scandal after scandal, accountability is the exception rather than the rule. Nearly a decade ago, the department went after the late Senator Ted Stevens. Many suspected politics was a motivation to cut corners. Judicial investigators found 2 federal prosecutors committed intentional misconduct, but the department's Office of Professional Responsibility watered it down to quote-unquote reckless misconduct. After years of appeals and administrative proceedings, guess what? these folks are still federal prosecutors. I'd like to enter without objection that staff memo in the record at this point. Now we have these senior FBI officials caught red-handed by their techs. I just want to remind everyone that former Director Comey said on multiple occasions what he said. He said his people at the FBI did not give tips or give a rip about politics. Sometimes he said they didn't give a hoot about it. Whether it was either a rip or a hoot, either way, he was flat wrong. Presidential politics was a major preoccupation for those at the heart of both cases related to the 2016 election, including Director Comey. His subordinates said that they were under enormous pressure to wrap it up before the political conventions. He was concerned about how it would look if Clinton won, and he had not reopened the case in October to examine the new evidence. Director Comey testified here on May 3 last year that he had never been an anonymous source or authorized anyone to be one in any story on these controversies. Well, I'm starting to wonder about that. The Inspector General recently concluded in another report that former Deputy Director McCabe improperly authorized media leaks to make himself look good. Then he lied about it multiple times, both under oath and to Mr. Comey. Mr. McCabe denies that, and his lawyers claim that there are emails with Mr. Comey that would vindicate him. The FBI hasn't provided any such emails, and the Inspector General's report doesn't mention any. Neither man could agree to come here and explain it to the committee. Whatever happened, it is a sad state of affairs for the former top 2 employees and officials at the FBI to be in a swearing contest over press leaks. Justice should be blind. Law enforcement needs to ignore politics, follow the facts, and embrace oversight as a way to improve. The Inspector General's report ought to be a step, really step one, in the right direction. But consequences must follow. Senator Feinstein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. Inspector General Horowitz, thank you for the hard work that you and your staff has done. This is a very big report. I think the largest I've seen in at least 2 decades. We look forward to hearing from you and from Director Wray. After an 18-month investigation that included review of more than 1.2 million documents and interviews with more than 100 witnesses, the Inspector General found no evidence of political bias in the FBI's investigation of Secretary Clinton or in the decision not to pursue criminal charges. As the report says, the IG, quote, did not find documentary or testimonial evidence that improper considerations, including political bias, directly affecting the specific investigative decisions we reviewed. The IG also found no evidence that the conclusions by the prosecutors were affected by bias or other improper considerations. Rather, we determined that they were based on the prosecutor's assessment of the facts, the law, and past department practice, well as it should be. The Inspector General also concluded that Director Comey violated Department of Justice policies when he spoke publicly and informed Congress about the investigation. On July 5th, 2016, 4 months before the election, Mr. Comey held a press conference and announced the FBI would not recommend criminal charges. Yet Director Comey also personally criticized Secretary Clinton in the middle of her presidential campaign. The IG found that Director Comey's criticism, and I quote, was contrary to long-standing department practice and protocol, end quote, for, quote, essentially trashing the subject of an investigation with uncharged misconduct that Comey, every agent, and every prosecutor agreed did not warrant prosecution, end quote. Following his July 5th announcement, Mr. Comey testified before Congress numerous times and spoke at length about the Clinton investigation, ensuring that this would remain in the press during the final months of the presidential election. Then, on October 28, 2016, Mr. Comey informed Congress that he had reopened the investigation. However, after it finally performed its due diligence, the FBI determined there was nothing new or significant. The Inspector General also specifically criticized the October 28th notification to Congress as also violating, quote, long-standing department and FBI policies and norms, end quote. As explained in the report, and I quote, the department and the FBI consistently declined to comment publicly or to Congress regarding ongoing investigative activity. However, while the report is highly critical of Director Comey, it did not find that he was biased against President Trump or in favor of Secretary Clinton, as some have alleged. During the election, Director Comey, the FBI, and the Justice Department spoke publicly about the Clinton investigation, but remained silent on the investigation into the Trump campaign's ties to Russia. And while there were multiple leaks to the press about the Clinton investigation, there was not a single leak about the investigation of the Trump campaign. Both investigations were ongoing during the presidential election, but only the Clinton investigation was discussed publicly. This unquestionably harmed candidate Clinton and helped candidate Trump. The president is now citing the Inspector General's report to justify his decision to fire Director Comey. However, at the time, candidate Trump applauded the October announcement, declaring at a rally in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and I quote, Director Comey did the right thing, end quote. In addition, one day after he fired Director Comey, the president reportedly told Russian officials that firing Comey relieved the pressure from the Russia investigation. And 2 days after the firing, President Trump himself told Lester Holt he fired Director Comey for, quote, the Russia thing, end quote. This is under investigation by Special Counsel Mueller, and the IG's report provides no support for the claim that Mr. Comey was fired because of his handling of the Clinton investigation. The report also finds that some employees expressed personal political views through text messages on workplace devices. Many messages criticized Donald Trump, but there were also some that criticized Hillary Clinton and others. Importantly, the report found no evidence that these personal political views tainted workplace decisions. In fact, 2 of the employees who exchanged messages, Peter Strzok and Lisa Page, were also identified in the report as advocating some of the most aggressive action in the Clinton investigation. For example, Mr. Strzok wrote the initial draft of the October 28th letter announcing the reopening of the Clinton investigation. The IG and his office have spent a year and a half examining this. They have reviewed all of these text messages. They have interviewed these employees, and they found no evidence that political views influenced the Clinton investigation. The overwhelming lesson to be taken from this report is the danger of public discussion in ongoing investigations. Throughout the Clinton investigation, Republicans in Congress demanded information from Director Comey and the Justice Department under subpoena and threat of contempt. Today, they are doing the same thing with Special Counsel Mueller's investigation. It was wrong then, and it's wrong now. The Inspector General report says, quote, "The stay silent principle exists to protect the privacy and reputational interests of the subjects of the investigation, the right to a fair trial for those subsequently accused of crimes, the integrity of an ongoing investigation or pending litigation, and the department's ability to effectively administer justice without political or other undue outside influences," end quote. Instead of demanding disclosure of information about Special Mueller's ongoing investigation, Congress should protect the integrity and investigation of that work. Let me say in closing, while I disagree with his actions, I have seen no evidence that Mr. Comey acted in bad faith or that he lied about any of his actions. As we consider this report, let's not lose sight of the fact that the IG found no evidence that the FBI and Justice Department are politicizing investigations, and nothing warrants the attacks that we are seeing on the FBI, the Justice Department, or Special Counsel Mueller's investigation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Feinstein. I will give a short introduction of our two witnesses, and then I would administer an oath before they testify. Michael Horowitz, Inspector General for the Justice Department, was confirmed April 2012 and oversees a nationwide workforce of more than 400 employees. Immediately preceding this post, he was in private practice and also previously worked for the Justice Department's Criminal Division. The Inspector General's mission is to detect and deter waste, fraud, abuse, and misconduct. Its mission is to also promote economy and efficiency in the department's operation. Christopher Wray is the director of the FBI, confirmed August last year. He is in charge of the Bureau's day-to-day operations as well as overseeing the performance of field offices and special branches nationwide. From 2003 to 2005, Mr. Wray served as Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division at DOJ. Mr. Wray also served as Associate Deputy General and then Principal Associate Deputy Attorney General prior to his promotion in 2003. And I know as well that he was in private practice for a while before he became FBI Director. If you would stand, I would like to administer an oath. Do you affirm that the testimony you're about to give before the committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you both for that affirmation. We'll start with General Horowitz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Feinstein, members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to testify today. Our 500-plus page report provides a thorough, comprehensive, and objective recitation of the facts related to the department's and the FBI's handling of the Clinton email investigation. It was the product of 17 months of investigative work by a dedicated OIG team that reviewed well over 1.2 million documents and interviewed more than 100 witnesses, many on multiple occasions. The review team followed the evidence wherever it led, and through their efforts, we identified the inappropriate text and instant messages discussed in the report. Additionally, the OIG's painstaking forensic examinations recovered thousands of text messages that otherwise would have been lost or undisclosed. As detailed in our report, we found that the inappropriate political messages we uncovered cast a cloud over the mid-year investigation, sowed doubt about the credibility of the FBI's handling of it, and impacted the reputation of the FBI. We found the implication that senior FBI employees would be willing to take official action to impact a presidential candidate's electoral prospects to be deeply troubling and antithetical to the core values of the FBI and the Justice Department. With regard to the decision to close the investigation without prosecution, we found no evidence that the conclusions by the prosecutors were the result of improper considerations, including political bias, but rather were exercises of prosecutorial discretion by the prosecutors based on their assessment of the facts, the law, and past department practice. Our review also included a fact-based, detailed assessment of certain specific investigative and prosecutorial decisions that were the subject of controversy. It was necessary to select particular investigative decisions because it would not have been possible to recreate and analyze every decision made in a year-long investigation. In examining these decisions, the question we considered was not whether a particular decision was the most effective choice, but rather whether the documentary and testimonial evidence indicated the decision was based on improper considerations, including political bias. This approach is consistent with the OIG's handling of such questions in past reviews when assessing discretionary judgment calls and recognizes and respects the institutional oversight role of the OIG. Our report provides a comprehensive assessment of these decisions and of the mid-year investigation and details the factual evidence so that the public, Congress, and other stakeholders can conduct their own assessment of them. Within this framework, as to the specific investigative and prosecutive decisions we reviewed, we did not find documentary or testimonial evidence that improper considerations, including political bias, directly affected those specific decisions, in part because the decisions were made by the larger mid-year team or the prosecutors. This determination by the OIG, as I noted, does not mean that we necessarily endorse the decisions or conclude they were the most effective options among those considered, or that our finding should or can be extrapolated to cover other decisions made during the course of the investigation by the FBI employees who sent these inappropriate text messages. Conversely, we found the FBI's explanations for its failures to take immediate action after discovering the Wiener laptop in October 2016 to be unpersuasive, and we did not have confidence that the decision of Deputy Assistant Director Strzok to prioritize the Russia investigation over following up on the Wiener laptop was free from bias in light of his text messages. We also found that in key moments, then FBI Director Comey clearly departed from FBI and department norms, and his decisions negatively impacted the perception of the FBI and the Justice Department as fair administrators of justice. Director Comey concealed from the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General his intention to make a unilateral announcement in July 2016 about the reasons for his recommendation not to prosecute former Secretary Clinton. His July 5th statement included inappropriate commentary about uncharged conduct, announced his views on what a quote-unquote reasonable prosecutor would do, and served to confuse rather than clarify public understanding of his recommendation. In late October, he again acted without adequately consulting department leadership and contrary to important department norms when he sent a letter to Congress announcing renewed investigative activity days before the election. There are many lessons to be learned from the department's and the FBI's handling of the mid-year investigation. But among the most important is the need to respect the institution's hierarchies and structures and to follow established policies, procedures, and norms, even in the highest profile and most challenging investigations. No rule, policy, or practice is perfect, of course, but at the same time, neither is any individual's ability to make judgments under pressure or in what may seem like unique circumstances. When leaders and officials adhere to bedrock principles and values, the public has greater confidence in the fairness and rightness of their decisions, and those institutions' leaders better protect the interests of federal law enforcement and the dedicated professionals who serve us all. By contrast, The public's trust is negatively impacted when law enforcement officials make statements reflecting bias, when leaders abandon institutional norms and the organizational hierarchy in favor of their own ad hoc judgments, and when the leadership of the department and the FBI are unable to speak directly with one another for the good of the institutions. Our report makes 9 recommendations, most of which can be tied together through a common theme, that the FBI and the Justice Department remain true to their foundational principles and values in all their work. That concludes my prepared statement. I'd be pleased to answer the committee's questions.
Dr. Ray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Feinstein, members of the committee. I appreciate this opportunity to discuss the FBI's response to the report by the Justice Department's Office of Inspector General about the DOJ and FBI's activities in the run-up to the 2016 election. I take this report very seriously, and we accept its findings and its recommendations. We're already addressing these recommendations in a number of ways and are determined to emerge from this experience better and wiser. Our mission at the FBI is to protect the American people and uphold the Constitution. And to carry out that mission, we're entrusted with significant authority, so our actions are subject to close oversight by the Congress, by the courts, and by independent entities like the Inspector General. That oversight, in my view, makes the FBI stronger as an organization and makes the public more safe. And so I appreciate the Inspector General's work in conducting this important review. Although the report did not find any evidence of political bias or improper considerations ultimately impacting the investigation under review, the report did identify errors of judgment, violations of or disregard for policy, and decisions that, at least in the benefit of hindsight, were certainly not the best choices. So I'd like to briefly summarize what we're doing to respond to those findings and recommendations. First, we are going to hold accountable any employee for potential misconduct. We have already referred conduct highlighted in the report to our Office of Professional Responsibility, OPR, which is the FBI's independent disciplinary office. We're going to adhere to the disciplinary process that office has fairly, but without delay. And once all the steps in that process are complete, we will not hesitate to hold people accountable. Second, we're going to make sure that every FBI employee understands the lessons of this report through in-depth, focused training, starting first at the top with all of our senior executives from around the world, and then every FBI employee, to make sure that we do not repeat the mistakes identified in this report. Third, we're going to make sure that we have the policies, the procedures, and the training needed for everyone to understand and remember what is expected of all of us. That includes things like drilling home the importance of objectivity and avoiding even the appearance of potential bias or conflicts of interest in our work, ensuring that recusals are handled appropriately and correctly and are clearly communicated to the right people, making all employees fully aware of our new policy on contacts with the news media, which I issued last November, and making clear that we will not tolerate noncompliance with that policy. Ensuring that we follow all DOJ policies about public statements on ongoing investigations and uncharged conduct, and ensuring that our employees adhere strictly to the policies and procedures we have on the use of FBI systems, networks, and devices. I've also directed our Associate Deputy Director, who's the number 3 official in the organization, to lead a very focused review of how the FBI handles particularly sensitive investigations, how they're structured, staffed, supervised, so that every sensitive investigation can be conducted to the FBI's highest standards. The OIG's report makes clear that we have significant work to do. And as I said, we're going to learn from the report and be better as a result. At the same time, I want to emphasize that this report is focused on a specific set of events back in 2016 and a small number of FBI employees connected with those events. Mistakes made by those employees do not define our 37,000 men and women and the great work they do every day. Nothing in this report impugns the integrity of our workforce as a whole or the FBI as an institution. I want to be very clear with this committee about the FBI that I've been able to see up close every day in the 10 months since my confirmation hearing before you all. I've been meeting with employees from over 30 of our field offices, from LEGAT offices overseas, from every headquarters division, and over and over and over again, I hear incredible stories, remarkable, inspiring stories about the work our men and women are doing to protect the American people and uphold the Constitution. This year alone, we've rescued over 1,300 children from child predators. We've arrested more than 4,600 violent gang members in just the past several months. In the past several months, we've disrupted terrorist attacks ranging from the pier in San Francisco to a crowded shopping mall in Miami. I could go on, but the point is that the FBI's men and women as a whole are doing all this work with the unfailing fidelity to our Constitution and laws that it demands, the bravery that it deserves, and the integrity that the American people rightly expect. As I've been trying to say since my confirmation hearing at every opportunity, I am committed to doing this job by the book, and I expect all our employees to do the same in every respect. I am a huge believer in the importance of process, and I believe strongly that the FBI's brand over 110 years is based more on the way we've accomplished our successes than our successes themselves. That means following our rules, following our laws, following our guidelines. We've got to stay faithful to our core values and best traditions, and there will inevitably be times when we feel extraordinary pressure to not follow our process and policies, but those are precisely the times when it's most important to adhere to them. We're trying to make sure that we're not just doing the right thing, but that we're doing it in the right way and pursuing the facts independently and objectively, no matter who likes it. That, in my view, is the best way. That, in my view, is the only way to maintain the trust and credibility of the American people we serve. So, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Feinstein, members of the committee, thank you again for the opportunity to address the report. I look forward to answering the committee's questions.
Thank you. And I believe staff has probably informed each member of the committee that we'll have 8-minute rounds. And because of 3 votes on the floor of the United States Senate at 5:30, we'll probably only end up having 1 round. First to Mr. Horowitz. The IT worker who managed the Clinton server lied to the FBI repeatedly. He denied deleting the Clinton emails. He denied that Clinton staff had ever asked him to delete the emails. He denied knowing the emails were under a preservation order. On March 2015, he had a call with Clinton's lawyers. Right after that, he used BleachBit to delete the Clinton emails. He invoked the Fifth Amendment to avoid questions about that call. He even sent an email saying that he was part of, quote, Hillary cover-up operation, end of quote. He later claimed that that was only a joke. But there was no search warrant or subpoena for the laptops used by the Clinton lawyers to see what they knew about what he did. He did not get the Mueller treatment. No charges for lying to the FBI repeatedly. No pressure to flip and testify against Clinton lawyers. Quite the opposite. He got immunity. This is a good example of a double standard in these 2 investigations and why more and more people are starting to believe the Mueller investigation lacks fairness. The report noted that Director Comey pressured the team to close the case before the party convention, and he had already made up his mind to close it before all the work was done. Question number 1, isn't it improper to set a deadline to close a case based upon political calendar?
Mr. Chairman, I think if that's the only basis for setting the deadline, that would be an area of concern. And that was something we did ask about in connection with our report. Given the various areas where Director Comey raised the concern about the political calendar, we had some information from some folks indicating that he separately suggested that in addition to concerned about the political calendar, that they also should follow up as need be for their work. So that was the evidence we had before us.
Is it a fair inference, General Horowitz, for people to think that the time pressure and the predetermined decision not to charge Clinton explain the lack of interest in trying to charge and flip the witness?
It's certainly, as we've laid out here, one of the reasons given by the prosecutors with regard to certain of their decisions, that they felt it would have dragged on the investigation for too long, and that was, in fact, a factor in their consideration on how to resolve certain issues.
A second point would involve you and the director of FBI. The report notes that department prosecutors did not believe there was a substantial federal interest to charge the IT worker who deleted Clinton's emails with obstruction and false statements. However, it was clear that he lied to the FBI twice about deleting Clinton's archived emails. The emails had been subpoenaed and were subject to congressional preservation notice. The technician knew that when he deleted them. Question number one to both of you. Is granting immunity the only way to obtain truthful testimony from a witness, and isn't there a substantial federal interest in determining obstruction of congressional investigations?
It isn't the only way to get testimony from individuals or information from individuals. Obviously, depends on the facts, and also, as we laid out in the report, we found the conduct to be particularly serious.
Director Wray?
Likewise, I think there are a number of ways to secure truthful testimony from witnesses, not just one. And certainly my own view is that efforts to obstruct investigations are something we need to take extremely seriously at the federal level.
Okay, thank you. To the Mr. Horowitz, did the officials specifically tell you that obstructing Congress was not a matter of substantial federal interest?
They didn't specifically say that to us. We asked them for their reasons, and they explained various other reasons that we lay out in the report.
Okay. Former Director Comey said on television that the Inspector General interviewed him about the handling of his memos of conversations with President Trump. Some of those memos contained classified information. Comey said he did not expect a report on his handling of classified information because, quote unquote, that's frivolous. I don't happen to think that it is frivolous. Question number one to Mr. Horowitz, are you investigating Comey's handling of his memos, and does that include the classification issues, and should Mr. Comey expect a report when it is complete?
We received a referral on that from the FBI. We are handling that referral, and we will issue a report when the matter is complete, consistent with the law and rules that are, and a report that's consistent and takes those into account.
Okay. In the FBI's response to the Inspector General's report, the FBI said, quote, there is no indication that any classified material ever transited former Director Comey, Ms. Page's, or Mr. Strzok's personal devices or accounts. But I thought neither the Inspector General nor the FBI actually looked at their personal devices. I sent a letter to you, Director Wray, this morning on this topic, but I wanted to ask you, how can the FBI conclude no classified material was on their personal devices if you didn't even look at their devices?
Mr. Chairman, first, as to your letter, I haven't obviously seen your letter of today, but I'm happy to take a look at it and make sure we're being responsive to you on that. On the second part of your question and the words in our response to the Inspector General's report, I don't think we're attempting to characterize some independent investigation of our own, but rather to refer to the language in the Inspector General's report and to clarify that the findings that we're reacting to did not themselves identify any passage of classified information.
Okay. During the course of the review, you found that several of the people investigating Secretary Clinton for using personal email were doing the same thing themselves. Each agency and every employee has an obligation to comply with the Federal Records Act. Question number one to Mr. Horowitz. In light of the the law's record-keeping requirements, how did you try to get access to their personal devices or accounts?
One of the challenges we had, as we note in the report, is that to gain access to personal emails would have required either a grand jury subpoena or a search warrant, given the facts of this case. And so we were limited, because our administrative subpoena authority doesn't cover this, to ask for voluntary cooperation. We were given oral representations. We were not given access to the email accounts.
Yeah. So I don't go over my 8 minutes. I think I'll reserve my 24 seconds. Senator Feinstein.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. During the 2016 presidential election, in addition to investigating Hillary Clinton's use of a private email server, the FBI was actively investigating whether the Trump campaign was coordinating with Russian officials to influence the election. Although the FBI revealed the existence of the Clinton investigation to the public, it kept the existence of the Trump campaign investigation secret. Director Comey made several public statements about the Clinton investigation during the election. Was there any information about anyone making public statements about the Trump campaign investigation during the election?
I'm not aware of any, and we lay out here the discussion about whether or not to speak to that issue.
There were also several leaks to the press about Clinton investigations during the election. Was there any evidence of leaks to the press about the Trump campaign investigation during the election?
I don't know as I sit here.
Is there any reason for this disparity in treatment between the two investigations?
Our focus in this review was on the Clinton email review. We laid out quite clearly why we thought Director Comey should not have been making the public statements he made back when he made them.
So I guess what you're saying is that the better approach was not to make public statements, and that goes to everybody, but you didn't specifically criticize it or find criticism.
That's correct. I mean, we looked at this one decision and what occurred. We laid out what the decision was with regard to other investigations, both Russia and, by the way, the Clinton Foundation investigation, where a decision was made also not to speak about it.
On October 25th, Trump's surrogate Rudy Giuliani appeared on Fox News and bragged that the Trump campaign had, quote, a surprise or two you're going to hear about in the next few days. I'm talking about some pretty big surprises, and I do think that all of these revelations about Hillary Clinton finally are beginning to have an impact. 3 days later, Director Comey announced that the FBI would be reopening its investigation into Hillary Clinton's use of a private email server. On November 4, when asked whether he had heard about the FBI's reopening of the email investigation, Giuliani said, "Did I hear about it? You're darn right I heard about it." He went on to say, "I had expected this for the last, honestly, to tell you the truth, I thought it was going to be 3 or 4 weeks ago." Were you able to determine how Mr. Giuliani received this information?
Senator, I'm not going to speak to any of the investigative steps we may or may not have taken for the very reasons we describe in here about what's appropriate to do in terms of following policy.
Well, what actions, if any, have been taken against the individuals responsible for disclosing this information to Mr. Giuliani?
As we note in the report, our investigative work's still ongoing. We put this in here so that the readers and the public could see our concerns about the number of contacts with the media and what was going on systemically, but I'm not in a position at this point to speak to any investigative outcomes.
Do you believe disclosures of this sort, especially during an election, are appropriate? Are they lawful?
I don't believe disclosures of this sort are appropriate at any point in time in a criminal investigation. I was a former prosecutor, worked extensively with FBI agents in my prior capacity, and all of us would have thought that was entirely inappropriate.
The report says that you, and I quote, will separately report on those investigations as they are concluded. Does this mean that this leak investigation is ongoing?
Our work remains ongoing, and when we can do that consistent with the IG Act, the law, policy, we will do so.
Republicans in Congress have pressured the Department of Justice to reveal details about Special Counsel Mueller's investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election and possible obstruction of justice. As a result, sensitive information about this ongoing investigation is now in the public domain. For example, a possible confidential informant has been identified. Is disclosure of the identity of a possible source in an ongoing investigation consistent with the stay silent principle identified in the report?
Senator, I obviously can't speak to any specific factual circumstances beyond what's in our report. I haven't done work on it. I will say just generally, it goes to my prior answer as well, which is if there's an ongoing investigation, disclosing information related to that through leaks is inappropriate.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Hatch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Listen to these findings from the Inspector General's report on the handling of the Clinton email investigation. Error of judgment, serious error of judgment, extremely poor judgment, and a gross lack of professionalism. Now, these are conclusions that were drawn, respectively, about the conduct of former Attorney General of the United States, the former director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and FBI special agents assigned to one of the highest profile investigations in the Bureau's history. In my opinion, this is appalling, and the significance of these findings cannot be overstated. The report identifies missteps at every level of the Department of Justice, from our nation's chief federal law enforcement officer to special agents in the field. Director Wray, I have to say that I was disappointed by your response last week to the Inspector General report. And while you admitted that the report found errors of judgment, you took pains to emphasize that the report focused on, quote, a small number of FBI employees, unquote. Well, let's remember who that small number of employees was. The director of the FBI, the deputy director of the FBI, the leader of both the Clinton email investigation and the Russia investigation. These were not junior field agents. These were senior agency officials. They were running two of the most important investigations in the Bureau's history, and they were insubordinate, grossly unprofessional in their communications, and even untruthful. So let's not pretend like this was some one-off problem. There is a serious problem with the culture at FBI headquarters. Your statement last week seemed to suggest we shouldn't worry too much about the events detailed in the Inspector General report because the report focuses on a small group of individuals and events. Well, I think that's exactly backwards. If we can look at only one or two investigations and find this much bias and unprofessionalism, I can only imagine what else is out there and what the Inspector General found about the conduct of senior Bureau leadership. I'd have to say he found out that it would certainly, in my opinion, be damning. Now, how can you assure Congress and the American people that you are taking seriously the problems identified in the Inspector General report when your very first public response to the report was to downplay its significance?
Senator, I don't intend in any way to downplay the significance of the report.
I don't think you do, but I'd like to know why.
Right. And I think the fact that the very first press conference I've held in my 10 months as FBI director was on this is a measure of how important I think this is. Start with that. Second, the steps that I've outlined that we're going to be taking are very significant, including, just as an example, but I could go on, convening every single SES employee in the entire FBI to come for a full day of training specifically focused on this is a measure of how seriously I take this. We're going to have the people whose conduct is highlighted in the report handled through our disciplinary process and held accountable as is appropriate. But my comments the other day are a measure of my view of the FBI. I don't have to imagine what happens in the FBI. I see the FBI up close every day, investigation after investigation after investigation, including in Utah, including in the states of every state represented up on this dais. And I can tell you that the conduct, the character, the principle that I see in those people every day is extraordinary and would be an inspiration to the members of this committee, and that was my point.
Okay, there should be no doubt that these errors cast a cloud over the FBI's handling of the Clinton email investigation and the investigation's credibility. Now, even more troubling is the irreparable harm to the FBI's reputation for neutral fact-finding and political independence. Where do we go from here? Now, you kind of indicated that.
Right. I think we start by reminding everyone in the FBI, which, as I said, I think the vast, vast, vast majority of the people who work there already know this, but I'm not going to leave that to doubt.
Okay.
That objectivity and the appearance of objectivity have to permeate everything we do. And that starts with, much as the lessons that have been described in this report chronicle, that starts with being focused not just on the result, but on the way you get to the result. That means following our processes, following our guidelines, following our long-established norms, to use the phrase in the report.
I accept all that. Now, I want to thank Inspector General Horowitz and you, the FBI Director Ray, for being here today to help answer that question. I want to focus on two issues identified in the report. The first is improper disclosures to the media, and the second is the political bias evidenced in text messages between FBI employees. The FBI has a policy that strictly limits the employees who are authorized to speak to the media. This is appropriate for any organization that quietly investigates with an eye towards prosecution in a court of law rather than the court of public opinion. But the Inspector General found that this policy was widely ignored by employees at all levels of the FBI. The report goes so far as to describe a culture of unauthorized media contacts, including instances where FBI employees improperly received tickets, golf outings, drinks, and other benefits from reporters. Now, as you know, this is totally inappropriate. Director Ray, attachments to the report identify more than 50 FBI employees, 50, who apparently had unauthorized contact with members of the media. If the Inspector General identified 50 employees in connection with his review of this one investigation, a counterintelligence investigation no less, I'm afraid that the number of employees engaged in such unauthorized conduct across the Bureau is likely to be far greater. Now, clearly, additional action is needed to identify other personnel engaged in leaks and unauthorized media contacts. I'm not interested in hearing about additional training, which is certainly necessary, but not sufficient. Director Ray, what are you doing to identify those who violate the FBI's policy, and what consequences will those employees face?
So a couple things we're doing that I'll mention. First, we, in addition to creating a new policy to make it painfully and crystally clear so no one can have an excuse that they don't know what the rules are, I put in place a new policy in November. Second, we've created a dedicated leak investigation unit inside the Bureau specifically focused to ensure that those investigations have priority. Third, we have an insider threat center that we've elevated to the assistant director level that's focused on pulling together all that, because these kinds of issues raise insider threat type concerns from my view. I've also asked the head of our OPR to report back to me promptly about whether or not there are additional things that she would need to make sure the penalties are even more severe. And we won't hesitate to throw the book at people who violate our rules on this.
Okay, thank you. I think my time is up.
Senator Leahy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is an interesting hearing. In practice, irony doesn't begin to describe President Trump and his allies exploiting this report for partisan gain. Clearly, some of Mr. Strzok's text messages were inappropriate. But if the FBI were trying to throw the election to Hillary Clinton, they could not have done a worse job. Look at the front pages of every newspaper leading up to the election. Every single misstep by the FBI damaged Hillary Clinton, helped Donald Trump. All FBI personnel, including Mr. Strzok, kept quiet about the Russian investigation, as they should. The same can be said about the Clinton investigation. Rudy Giuliani, James Kallstrom, apparently even Devin Nunes received highly sensitive leaks. Leaks from the New York field office may have even contributed to Director Comey's decision to send the now infamous October 28 letter, a letter that could not have come at a worse time, likely impacted the election. Now, last year I asked Director Comey specifically about leaks to Mr. Giuliani. He acknowledged for the first time that internal investigation was ongoing. Director Wray, was Mr. Comey telling the truth in that? He said here that there was an internal investigation ongoing about the leaks to Mr. Giuliani. Was he correct?
Senator, I can't speak to what Director Comey was or wasn't
I'm just
saying.
asking, but was he correct that there is an internal investigation ongoing on the leaks to Mr. Giuliani?
Senator, for reasons that I'm sure you can appreciate, I can't confirm or deny the existence of an ongoing investigation, whether there is one or isn't one.
Okay.
One of the main lessons of this
The only
report,
reason I raise it is there was an open hearing. Former Director Comey said there was such an internal investigation.
well, there are a number of things that I probably would have done differently.
Mr. Horwitz, you want to take a stab at that? Or
I'm certainly not going to comment on whether or not there is an open or ongoing investigation, one way or the other. We have, over the years, refused to do that, and I'm not going to change the policy now.
Well, Mr. Horwitz, you and I have known each other a long time. I assume that's the answer you give. But here we know about Mr. Strzok's private life, and we know about his text messages, but we know nothing about the leaks from FBI personnel who are actively taking steps to sway the election to Mr. Trump. You did not include an investigation of those leaks in your report. Is that correct?
That's correct for the reasons we noted, that we're not able to speak to work we might have ongoing.
Well, I would hope that the investigation is ongoing. At some point, you report to us, because it was generally accepted around here that leaks were going to Mr. Kallstrom, were going to Mr. Giuliani during the campaign. In fact, Mr. Giuliani basically said so on TV. Now, the president says that this report totally exonerates him and says there's no collusion with the Russians. Now, Inspector General Horwitz, did your report even consider the question of collusion?
Our report was focused on the FBI and department's handling of the Clinton email investigation. It touched on the Russia investigation, as we lay out here, when we found the text messages in that July-August time period, and then the decision that was made in October about whether to proceed or not proceed with the Wiener laptop. That was the sum total of our.
But there's nothing in the report that says it exonerates the president from any question of collusion with the Russians. It says nothing one way or the other. Is that correct?
We did not look into collusion questions.
So I just note the president says it totally exonerates him, even though there's no conclusion one way or the other about the question of collusion with the Russians. Now, Director Wray, after learning that the FBI utilized a confidential source during the early stage of the Russia investigation, the president described that as a scandal bigger than Watergate. I'm one of the few people here, the only person in the Senate that remembers directly knowledge of Watergate. I tend to disagree with him. And I'd say the confidential sources are a routine investigative tool. I've got I have a document that is publicly available in the FBI's online FOIA library. It's a redacted interview summary from the Clinton investigation. It shows that the FBI used a confidential human source in September 2015, well into Secretary Clinton's campaign for president. So, Director, does a possible use of confidential sources in either the Clinton or Russia investigation by itself show any wrongdoing by the FBI?
Senator, as you alluded to, we use confidential informants in all manner of investigations covering kind of the waterfront, and it's a very, very, very important tool in that mission.
Any of us who have been prosecutors know you probably don't have a significant prosecution without some confidential sources. Now, Director Wray, the President said on Friday the Mueller investigation has been totally discredited by the Inspector General report. I asked you last month when you were before the Appropriations Committee about the Russia investigation. You confirmed at that time you do not believe it is a witch hunt. Now, the special counsel investigation has already resulted in the indictment of 20 individuals, 3 Russia companies. Do you have any reason to believe that this investigation has been discredited?
Senator, as I said to you last month, and as I said before, I do not believe Special Counsel Mueller is on a witch hunt.
Thank you, and I appreciate that. And you were very direct in both occasions. Now, the mistakes made by Director Comey during the Hillary Clinton investigation didn't exist in a vacuum. Republicans in Congress relentlessly pressured the FBI to release details concerning the Clinton investigation. I'm deeply concerned that we're repeating these mistakes today. The White House, working with allies in Congress, have been aggressively demanding information from the Russia investigation. And Director Wray and the Deputy Attorney General pushed back. They've been threatened with impeachment. That's outrageous. Obviously, something will never happen. But some accommodations have been made. And members of Congress, eager to politicize any details, have reviewed a FISA application and learned the identity of a confidential source. Are you confident that kind of precedent will not damage the FBI in the future?
Senator, I think we have 2 competing interests that we have to balance. We have an obligation to be responsive to congressional oversight. That's important. I think that's part of our job. But we also have an obligation to protect sources and methods, to protect ongoing criminal investigations, to respect things like grand jury secrecy. And it's a challenge at times to do both, but I'm confident that we can do both as long as both sides are willing to work together on it, and I'm committed to trying to do both.
Senator
Thank
Cornyn.
you very much.
Senator Cornyn.
General Horowitz, I believe your report summarizes, as regards to former Director Comey, that he concealed from the Attorney General his intention to make a unilateral declaration or declination of intent to pursue charges against Secretary Clinton. He made inappropriate comments on uncharged conduct. He erred when he said that he usurped really the role of the Attorney General in the Department of Justice when he said that no reasonable prosecutor would bring charges under the facts, and that he violated a number of Department of Justice policies and norms. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I think your opinion was certainly reinforced by op-ed pieces by former Attorney General Holder when he wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post, and by Jamie Gorelick and Larry Thompson, former Deputy Assistant Attorney Generals, in an article they wrote, James Comey is damaging our democracy. The Rosenstein memo that was written by the Deputy Attorney General, forwarded to the Attorney General, and then attached, I think, to a letter whereby the President informed Mr. Comey that his services as Director of the FBI were being terminated. Substantially similar to what you found in your report, correct?
I haven't gone back recently and read the letter. I think it's a straightforward comparison that could be made about it. I'll leave it at that.
Well, the way I read it, it looks to me like you validated what Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein said in his memorandum. Would you dispute that, or do you agree with that?
I wouldn't dispute it, but I haven't gone back recently and reread it.
I think what's so disturbing about this era in the FBI leadership is it just seemed to be a culture of impunity where the rules did not apply to the director and his leadership team, but obviously were designed to apply to everybody else. And by the way, I agree with Director Wray when he talks about rank and file FBI professionals. We're not talking about them. We're talking about a group that somehow went terribly awry in the leadership team of Director Comey. General Horowitz, you mentioned that you found no evidence of bias in the investigation, but you qualify that in talking about documentary and testimonial evidence. Right. Are you discounting the text messages from Mr. Strzok and Ms. Page, for example?
No, what we were trying to do was be clear that we were focused on the very specific investigative decisions we looked at, and what was significant about the and I'm now talking about the pre-July 5 announcement decisions, was that Strzok, Page, and others were not the sole decision makers there. They were team decisions, and in many cases, prosecutors' decisions, as opposed to the individuals who wrote the emails. We made very clear we were not saying that as to every single decision. As you know from doing these kind of cases, there are hundreds of decisions being made, and in fact, we did not find no bias with regard to the October events.
Well, Director Comey was pretty clear that he expected Hillary Clinton to be the next president of the United States, correct?
He described that with regard to, yes, the October events, the Wiener laptop.
And sometime in the spring of 2016, he had already decided that there would be no recommendation to prosecute Hillary Clinton, correct?
Yes, he started drafting his statement on May 2nd.
And it wasn't until July 5th when he made his initial press conference where he said that the evidence did not rise to the point where any reasonable prosecutor basically would prosecute Ms. Clinton, correct?
That's correct.
Do you think it's possible, or let me just ask you, is it a fair inference to draw that Director Comey, expecting Ms. Clinton to win the presidency, was thinking about his future as the FBI director?
I think that was a concern we had, certainly where it's even clearer in that October time period, because we have testimony that indicated that when he explained through his chief of staff why he was going to do what he did on October 28, he was concerned about his survivability.
And when, for example, he used the word grossly negligent, which are the words of the statute, in describing Ms. Clinton's conduct, later on it was changed to extremely careless. Do you feel like he was writing toward a preordained result, or that this was a genuine process to think through what the evidence was and to try to apply the applicable law?
I think that would be hard to say and probably be speculation in terms of what he was thinking at the time. We try and lay out in great detail various places, including that, how it changed and how it evolved and why. But I'm not sure I can sit here and say precisely what was his thinking on the time.
Were you shocked to learn that Director Comey had his own private Gmail account at a time he was investigating a potential prosecution of Ms. Clinton for recklessly using a private email server?
I have to say it surprised us that he would have been sending emails, although they were unclassified, but nevertheless using a personal Gmail account.
Director Wray, Director Comey has talked about higher loyalty to his own sense of justice and his belief that that was required in order to protect the reputation of the FBI rather than to follow established policies and guidelines and the law. I believe that hubris that Director Comey was demonstrating and suggesting that the rules did not apply to him that applied to everybody else has brought this firestorm down on the FBI. Do you think it's appropriate for any director of the FBI to attribute their actions to a higher loyalty to some other cause other than the rule of law and the policies and guidelines of the Department of Justice?
Well, Senator, I don't want to speak to what Director Comey may or may not have been thinking, but what I can tell you is that my own view is that the rules, the policies, the guidelines, the long-established norms, as the Inspector General's report refers to them, those things are there for a reason, and it's important that we track those. And that's why when I'm going around from field office to field office, doing town halls with over 30 offices, the point I keep making everywhere is that it's not enough to say that you're going to do the right thing for the right reason. That pretty quickly can become the ends justify the means. What we need to be doing is doing the right thing in the right way. So not let the ends justify the means, but let our means justify our ends.
Well, General Horowitz, I believe that your report, as comprehensive as it was, and I commend you on the great care that you've undertaken. I don't necessarily agree with every word of it, especially the no finding of no bias, but I think your findings call into question the credibility of the whole Clinton email investigation and cast a cloud over the Russian investigation, because the same group of people that led the Clinton email investigation were leading the Russian investigation until at least such time as Director Mueller, the special counsel, terminated their services because of the appearance of conflict of interest. Do you share those concerns?
I share the concerns, and we wrote, in fact, here that it did cast a cloud over the entire Clinton email investigation.
And the Russian investigation?
Well, we haven't reached a conclusion on that, but we laid out here the concern that when the choice was made in October, whether to work on in terms of Mr. Strzok in particular, the Russian investigation versus the Wiener laptop matter, the choice was to make that a higher priority, the Russia matter, over the Clinton matter, and we were not convinced that that was not a biased decision.
Senator Durbin.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for your testimony. The communication which you go into detail describing between Peter Strzok and Lisa Page includes some damning statements, and you make that very clear in your conclusion about their possibly using their governmental authority to achieve a political result. Is that correct?
That's correct. I felt that was very serious error.
And that should not be downplayed by anyone. It was serious.
That should not be downplayed by anybody. I can't think of something more concerning than a law enforcement officer suggesting that they're going to try and use or may use their powers to affect an election.
What did Special Counsel Mueller do when he learned about these statements by Mr. Strzok?
We informed him on July 27 of last year of our first findings of these texts. We subsequently gained more, but my understanding is within a week or two of that date, he had been removed from the investigation.
Which was the right thing to do. And I want to make it clear based on previous questioning here. No one is making excuses for these things. Mr. Strzok said something that was inappropriate, unacceptable for a person in his position. Mr. Mueller responded professionally and terminated him as soon as he learned that. I hope that's on the record and clear. You spent a lot of time, and I want to echo the comments made earlier in this work, reviewing all these documents, text, and interviewing all these witnesses. And I know you, and I've heard your testimony, and there's no doubt that you know this Inspector General's report in detail. Lots of people reacted to it. Politicians, individuals, news commentators, and others. I'm going to ask you, for the record, specifically your thoughts on one reaction. Last Friday, President Trump said, and I quote, "I think that the report yesterday, maybe more importantly than anything, it totally exonerates me. There was no collusion. There was no obstruction. And if you read the report, you'll see that," the president said. He went on to say, "I did nothing wrong. There was no collusion. There was no obstruction. The IG report yesterday went a long way to show that." End of quote. General Horowitz, does your report totally exonerate President Trump?
I'm going to stick, Senator, to what our report does speak to, which is the handling of the Clinton email investigation, and to the extent it touches on the Russia investigation, it does it as we lay out here when the Wiener laptop comes up in October, and I can't speak beyond that to how this report might impact the Russia investigation or what individuals think how it may impact the Russia investigation.
I ask you to clarify that. You can't speak to whether your report exonerates because it does or it doesn't? What are you saying?
We did not investigate, as we laid out here. When we saw those text messages, many of which are in that July-August time period, we've made it quite clear here that this review does not touch on the Russia investigation with the exception of what occurred in October with the Wiener laptop.
And does it say anything as to the issues of collusion and obstruction in that Russian investigation?
We don't go into any issues related to the Russia investigation beyond what I mentioned.
Last Friday, when he was talking about the IG report, President Donald Trump said the special counsel investigation led by Robert Mueller, quote, has been totally discredited. Mr. Horowitz, does your report show any reason to doubt Robert Mueller's integrity or discredit any decisions he has made?
I'm not going to make, Senator, a judgment on Special Counsel Mueller's investigation. I'm going to speak to what I have here.
I want to stay within the four corners of your report.
And
you address the credibility of the investigation of Robert Mueller.
We did not address the credibility of the Special Counsel's investigation here. We laid out what occurred, and we laid out what individuals did in October where it touches the Russia investigation.
Last Thursday, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said in an interview with the Washington Examiner he wanted the Mueller investigation to conclude. He said, quote, if the IG is through, why can't the Mueller investigation finally wrap up? Was there any connection in substance or duration between what you were tasked in doing and what Robert Mueller is tasked in doing?
Again, other than the issues we talked about where we identified text messages and brought them to his attention, we do not have any connections, interactions in that regard.
Director Wray, my colleague Senator Leahy and others have raised the question about the New York field office and leaks in that field office. And there are quotes in the report relative to Mr. Comey's concern that New York field office would leak information. And that's one of the reasons why he made certain decisions. As Senator Leahy said, former Mayor Giuliani has bragged publicly about information that he's received from that office. What are we to make of this? Is this being investigated? Is this just a problem that is acknowledged and accepted?
Senator, I think leaks are unacceptable. I think they have a pernicious effect on our ability to conduct investigations, to protect sources and methods, to retain our foreign liaison partner relationships. They damage the privacy of individuals under investigation. I could go on and on. So I have a very strong view about it, and we're doing a number of things to try to make sure we crack down on it.
That's what I want to get to. Right. What are we doing about it?
Well, I can't comment on any specific investigation, but we have, as I think I mentioned earlier, we have a dedicated unit specifically focused on leak investigations. That's new. We have a policy that we issued in November that makes the rules crystal clear so that there can't be any ambiguity for any of our employees in any office about what their obligations are. And when there are misconduct found, we will refer them to our OPR for appropriate action, and if we find one that's criminal, we will pursue it criminally.
Mr. Director Wray, I just have a minute and a half left, and I'd like to ask one last question, please. There was a question raised earlier about Mr. Comey having a separate personal phone that he was using, and whether or not that was an unusual thing for a person in his position. There's been reportedly the president uses 2 White House-issued iPhones. One allows him to make calls. The second is for his Twitter habit. According to Politico, the president has, quote, resisted his aides and treaties to swap out the Twitter phone on a monthly basis because it's too inconvenient. Supposedly, the president has given Kim Jong-un his direct phone number. If he was referring to his cell phone, this would raise some interesting security concerns. Are you aware of these reports about various phones that are being used by the president? Are you concerned about whether or not sensitive information from those devices may be intercepted by our adversaries?
Senator, I'm not aware of the particulars of the president's phone usage.
Would it be a matter of concern if anyone who has access to such information was using a device that could be intercepted by our enemies?
I think it's important for all of us to recognize that device security is a particularly important part of our security, and it's something that we emphasize heavily in the intelligence community.
And of course, we've gone to great lengths when it comes to Hillary Clinton to make that point. Thank you very much.
Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to both of you for being here. I want to point out one clarifying matter at the outset. The report did, in fact, find bias. So insofar as anyone is suggesting that there was no bias found here, that's just not true. There was, in fact, bias found. What was not found was any smoking gun indicating that that bias translated to and was admitted to have translated to how anybody did their job. But the absence of evidence on that point is not the same as evidence of absence. And so I think we need to keep that in mind as we have this discussion. Mr. Ray, I'd like to start with you on this point. Let's assume for a minute that these text messages between Strzok and Page, let's assume that these came about earlier in the discussion and that you just swap out the name Trump for Hillary, as such that the text messages said, well, she's not ever going to become president, is she? No, we'll stop it. What if that had been the exchange occurring earlier in the Midway investigation? In that circumstance, in that hypothetical, could she, as a practical matter, have been prosecuted, assuming that the facts warranted it, assuming that people making the charging decision concluded that there was good cause to charge her? Or would the bias displayed in that exchange make it too difficult to proceed?
Well, Senator, I'm reluctant to engage in discussions of hypotheticals.
It's what we do. We're lawyers. We talk about hypotheticals, right?
But I'm no longer practicing as a lawyer. Now I get to now I get to blame the lawyers. It's a wonderful experience. So I'm not going to try to engage in specific hypotheticals. What I would tell you is that I expect all of our employees to engage in professional conduct, including in how they communicate with each other by text message.
I get that, and that didn't happen here. So if let's make it more of a hypothetical then. Let's take it a step back. Could that be a complicating factor if you had text messages between agents involved in a case indicating bias against the target of that investigation? Can that be a complicating factor in deciding whether to bring charges?
I think any time that agents conduct themselves in a way that doesn't have not just objectivity but the appearance of objectivity, that can have an impact on the viability of the case.
Thank you. Mr. Horowitz, let's talk about these text messages for a minute. Was it easy for you to get them?
No, it was, well, the initial batch was easy. They were with the FBI, and we requested them. The latter part of this, over the last 6 months or so, was challenging.
Challenging. When you say challenging, tell me what you mean by that.
So when they were produced by the FBI, it turned out that there was a period during which, about 4 to 6 months, I don't remember the exact time, where there were no text messages produced to us. It turned out there was a flaw in their collection software, or a failure in their collection software. We then went out and seized and obtained their 2 phones, voluntarily, I shouldn't say seized, obtained their phones from the FBI. These are now FBI devices we're talking about. And our cyber forensic team actually undertook a series of steps to seek to exploit, to extract the missing text messages from the phones. We first used our own tools to do that. That was step 1. We then went to a contractor that we use, a vendor that we use, to see whether there were additional tools. They provided us with some additional tools, so we did a second extraction and gained more text messages. We then went to the Department of Defense and asked them if they had additional tools that those first 2 steps didn't use. They said they did, and they gave us those tools, and we used that and extracted more text messages. We then went to the FBI and said, okay, here are the steps we've taken. Do we miss anything? Would you do anything differently? They said they wouldn't. We then did a quality control check, as you're supposed to do, again, following the rules, our forensic examiners, and they discovered in that last search, which occurred last month in May, that the phone had a database on it that was actually also doing a collection of text messages. They extracted those messages from the phone and found the second part of the August 8th text, no, we'll stop it. That was found in early May because of that fourth effort to extract information from the phones. It turned out that the FBI wasn't aware that that database on there, which was supposed to be an operating function, was actually collecting data.
They weren't aware of that and didn't give it to you, but had they gone through the same steps you had gone through, they might have found it. In other
Correct.
words. Does that cause you to have any lack of confidence about whether or not you have all the evidence you need, all the evidence you've requested?
Yeah, clearly, as a result of that effort, and we're going to issue a separate report about the technological efforts we undertook there, and I'll be careful on how I describe them because I'm also a lawyer, not a cyber expert. But the concern is we now believe that not only are we unsure whether we have 100% collection in the period for which there was this blackout, 4 to 6 months, but it's now clear to us that even when the software at the FBI was collecting text messages, because the August 8th period was within the collection period, we had the incoming page to struck text. We didn't have the response. It's now clear to us that even outside this blackout period, we're not convinced that the FBI was collecting, for obvious reasons, 100% of the text messages.
Okay, that's obviously of concern. Mr. Ray, let's jump back to you for a minute. I think we can all agree that Mr. Comey should not have made his July 6th announcement and press conference. I assume you don't disagree with me on that. But would you have made a charging recommendation at all? Or would you have left that to the Department of Justice?
Well, Senator, as I said, we accept the findings and recommendations in the report. My own view is that the policies about public disclosure, as you've alluded to, are pretty clear about what we should or shouldn't do. As far as making charging recommendations privately, I think my view...
Yeah, I'm not talking about recommendations.
Right.
I'm talking about charging decisions.
So my view is that the FBI doesn't make charging decisions.
Okay, it just isn't done. Mr. Horowitz, the report says that Mr. Comey's machinations, quote, resulted in Lynch and Yates concluding that it would be counterproductive to speak directly with the FBI director. Can you unpack that for me? Help me understand what that means. Is the idea here that Lynch and Yates were simply afraid of exercising their authority, their oversight responsibilities, because they were afraid that it would look like political interference? What's that about?
So a couple things. They were responding to the fact that Director Comey, rather than speaking to them directly, went through his chief of staff to one of their aides to them to relay his view on what he was going to do. What they told us their assessment at that point was, based on their prior dealings with Director Comey, was, first of all, if they went to him directly and said, don't do it, it would, first of all, look like strong-arming, and they weren't sure whether he would comply or not with the instruction. They concluded that it would be more effective, or they would have a better chance of changing the decision if they went back the same way to him with their message, which was to their principal associate deputy AG, to his chief of staff, to him. And as we lay out here, they reported back through that means that they objected or recommended, or actually, let me clarify this, they told him that they did not believe he should do it. He's testified to us that he took that as a recommendation because they didn't call him directly, and he decided they were leaving the decision to him, and so he decided to go forward.
Before I call on Senator Klobuchar, I need a quick clarification. You said earlier in reply to Senator Corden that Comey used Gmail for work, but only for unclassified information. How can you know that if you didn't get access to that account?
I'm sorry, let me correct that. Based on the emails that we saw, which we observed by looking at the FBI's server and what ended up going back to the FBI, you're correct, Senator, I can't sit here today beyond what we looked at and say precisely what other purposes he may have used it for.
Okay. Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much. I wasn't going to start with this, but since Senator Lee was finishing up, I think it's good to continue with that discussion. And that is that I was a law school classmate of Director Comey. I think Director Wray knows this. I have worked with him over the years and know he's done some good work. But reading this report this weekend, I continue to disagree with his decision in how he handled those announcements. And the more I read of your report, which I thought was very thorough, I want to thank you for that, Mr. Horowitz, the more I began to focus on what you call the ad hoc decision-making based on his personal views, even if it meant rejecting long-standing department policy. And I guess I would start with you, Mr. Ray. The way I have described my job as a prosecutor in the past to people, when I do my own town hall meetings way back, I would always say it's like the show Law and Order. The first half of the show, the police do the investigation. The second half of the show, the prosecutors make a decision. Would you agree with that summary?
I think so. I guess the way I would put it is we do an investigation. We determine whether or not we think there are sufficient facts to go forward with a case, and then we present the facts to the prosecutors, who then make the decisions and exercise prosecutorial discretion. I don't think prosecutorial discretion, by definition, is something the investigative agency exercises.
Right. So you might discuss the case with the prosecutors, but in the end, they make the decision.
Yes.
And so if you had been in that place at that moment in time as the FBI director, would you have then called up in the July decision and the October decision, would you have then called up either the Attorney General or the Deputy Attorney General to ask them to make a decision?
Well, I don't know that I can speculate about what I would have done at the time. What I can tell you is that I cannot imagine a situation in which I would unilaterally assume for myself, as the FBI director, a charging decision and then announce it in a news conference.
Thank you. So that leads me to where I wanted to begin, and that is that when law enforcement officers act improperly, when they make mistakes, one of the great things about a democracy is we have an inspector general and we try to get that information out, and I think our democracy depends on that. But I don't think that should be confused with attacking the integrity of thousands of investigations that the FBI manages every year, investigations that are not even part of this report in any significant way, like the Russia investigation, and attacking the integrity of 35,000 FBI agents, analysts, and other public servants. I think it's very important that we defend them. And I note in your memo you did recently to the FBI after the Nunes memo was released over the objections of the FBI, you said, Director Wray, talk is cheap, the work you do is what will endure, and you urged employees to stay laser focused even when it's not easy. Could you elaborate on that?
Senator, I am a big believer in the idea that what really matters for the FBI is the work. And when I go around from office after office, the opinions that I care about the most, the brand, if you will, that I care about the most, are the opinions of the prosecutors we work with out in the field, the law enforcement partners we work out with in the field, the judges that we interact with out in the field, the juries we interact with out in the field, the victims who are making decisions about who they trust to get their loved ones back. And I think I've visited the field offices of almost every senator up here, and I will tell you that the work that they do, recovering kids who are victims of child exploitation, taking down gang members, disrupting terrorist plots, doing public corruption investigations, I could go on and on and on and on and on. And to me, those are people who experience the FBI through the work. Those are people who get to see the professionalism, the character, the integrity of FBI people up close. And we're a 37,000-person organization. We've been around for 110 years. We do thousands of investigations every year. This is one.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Horowitz, I want to go on to your report now, and much has been made by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle about some things that were clearly wrong that Director Wray has said there are ongoing internal investigations about this, and decisions are going to be made, and training is going to occur. but I don't want to lose the forest for the trees here in terms of what your report found. First of all, the President, upon the release of the report, tweeted that he, quote, hope the IG report is not being changed and made weaker, end quote. Can you confirm that your office followed all appropriate processes in the course of its review and that the report was not changed as a result of improper political influence?
We followed normal processes. We took comments. We made decisions on issuing the final report. It was not made weaker or softer in any regard.
Okay. In particular, the report clearly states on page 263 that it did not find evidence that the Justice Department's decision not to pursue prosecution following the investigation was politically motivated. Is that an accurate summary?
We did not find that the prosecutor's decision not to charge was the result of political bias.
And you found that the relevant decisions were based on the prosecutor's assessment of the facts in the law, as well as, in part, department practices. Is that correct?
As to the prosecutor's decision about whether or not to charge, that's correct.
Mm-hmm. To be clear, did you or your staff speak to any witness who would point to an example of anyone in the investigation allowing political considerations to affect their decisions on how to obtain evidence?
As I sit here, I don't recall anybody indicating that.
Did you or your staff review any documents indicating that a particular investigative decision, was made for political reasons?
Well, we had concerns about the October time period and Mr. Strzok's decision.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Did you, and you're talking here in part about you mentioned the Russia one, but the Comey decisions to go public, is that what you're referring to?
I'm sorry. I'm talking about in terms of, and maybe I misunderstood the question, in terms of were there any decisions, we had concerns about Mr. Strzok's handling of the choice in October between Russia and the Wiener laptop.
Got it. Did you determine that, and Senator Durbin has gotten the information out there about Inspector Mueller's investigation, and that's continuing, and that he is no longer, the person involved is no longer involved in that investigation?
That's correct. That's my understanding. That's correct.
Did you determine that any investigative action was a result of political bias or other improper considerations, besides what we just talked about?
Prior to July 5, the specific investigative decisions we looked at, we did not find evidence, testimony or documentary evidence that they were the subject of improper considerations, including political bias.
Did your report find that senior Justice Department leadership, including then Attorney General Lynch and Deputy Attorney General Yates, had a limited role in the investigation and instead appropriately relied on career staff rather than political appointees?
We do describe here their limited involvement prior to July 5 in the day-to-day operations of the investigation.
Senator Graham.
Could I just ask one more question?
If you do it quickly.
Did you find that the department's decision-making in this case was consistent with its approach in other circumstances in terms of investigation?
We found the prosecutors described to us their process and that, in fact, that is what they base their decisions on.
Thank you.
Senator Graham.
Would you say that this investigation was done by the book?
Hard to say what by the book is.
Well, who wrote this book? If this was done by the book, who wrote it?
I think there are reasons to raise questions on certain of these steps and decisions.
I think you did a good job, but the whole idea that this is normal, folks, there's nothing here normal. I don't want you to think the FBI does this day in and day out. This is not normal. Now, I think that's what you tried to find.
Yeah.
Do you believe it's pretty clear to everybody in the country by July the 5th that Donald Trump was the presumptive nominee of the Republican Party?
That's my recollection. And from the
since
text,
the
it's pretty
was on
clear.
the 18th. Yeah.
Right. And the texts, I think, reflect that as well.
Okay, I'm going to read this text message from Page to Strzok on August the 8th, after he'd gotten the nomination. She says, Trump's not ever going to become president, right? Right? Strzok responded, no, he's not. Well, stop it. Now, I don't know how you feel about that. That's pretty unnerving. Strzok, wasn't he the lead investigator of the Clinton email investigation?
He was, in essence, the lead investigator.
Okay, so the head guy looking at Clinton on August the 8th says we got to stop Trump. Now, was that just idle talk? A week later, here's what they say to each other. Strzok text message to Lisa Page. I want to believe the path you threw out for consideration in Andy's office, that there's no way he gets elected, but I'm afraid we can't take that risk. It's like an insurance policy in the unlikely event you die before you're 40. Now, that's a week later. Who's Andy?
Our understanding, it was Andy McCabe, the deputy director.
So you got the deputy director meeting with the lead investigator of the Clinton email investigation, and Miss Page, who's involved somehow, meeting in Andy's office discussing taking out an insurance policy to make sure Donald Trump doesn't become president? Is that what you're telling us?
I'll be clear. I can't speak to whether Mr. McCabe was there or not.
Did you ask Mr. McCabe?
We did. He said he was not. He did not recall.
So one of them's lying. So I want you to reopen this investigation and come back and tell us, do you believe Strzok or do you believe McCabe? Because you just told me the deputy director of the FBI says he's not the Andy.
Oh, just to be clear, they're talking about a conversation in his office.
Yeah.
He is stating he does not recall whether he was there or not. And neither of those individuals are putting him in the middle of their conversation.
All I'm saying is that the Andy's office where this occurred, he wasn't there. What did Strzok? Did Strzok say he was there?
Strzok says he was there.
Well, somebody's lying. So anyway, we'll figure that out later. None of this is normal, folks. Let's look at the actual interview itself. How many people were involved in the Clinton interview on July the 2nd?
There were, I believe, 6 or 8 people present, but 2 agents conducting the interview.
So as I understand it, there were 2 agents and 2 prosecutors.
Correct.
Okay. Now, this was an email sent in February 2016 from Page to McCabe. Mm-hmm. Hey, you've surely already considered this, but in my view, our best reason to hold the line at 2 and 2, 2 agents and 2 prosecutors, is she might be our next president. How did you feel about that?
We were concerned about it, and we lay out here why we were concerned.
Okay, let's keep talking about this interview. One of the FBI agents in the interview said on Election Day to another FBI agent, you should know that I'm with her. Now, her was Clinton, right?
Correct.
How do you feel about that?
Very concerned.
Okay, eventually very concerned gets to be enough already. Mm-hmm. I'm very concerned. You know, I'm glad I don't text an email. That's one thing I'm glad I don't do. But have you ever proved a case by circumstantial evidence, Director Ray?
Yes.
Well, I'm going to write you a letter and talk about why you should reconsider your findings as to whether or not it affected the investigation. Here's what Miss Page said on March the 4th, 2016. God, Trump is a loathsome human. How do you feel about that? I mean, she's entitled to her opinion.
I think we've laid out here why we were so concerned about it.
Well, when you add it all up, as early as March, these people hated Trump, and this investigation was anything but by the book. And at the end of the day, what Comey did just blows me away as much as it does y'all. And I can't believe that this happened to my FBI. I told you the story, Mr. Ray, Director Ray, about wanting to be part of the organization, and y'all were smart enough not to take me. The bottom line is, if you're on our side of the aisle, this really does hit you hard. And we can't just write it off. I think there was a lot of bias that did affect an investigation that is, to me, almost impossible to explain using any standard that I grew up with as a prosecutor or even as a defense attorney. This is Strzok to Page on October the 20th. Trump is an effing idiot. The bottom line is, I'm glad you found what you found, Mr. Horowitz. I'm not buying that the Clinton email investigation was on the up and up. And the reason I'm not buying it is because the 2 people intimately involved, one, the guy, the lead investigator, clearly did not want to see Donald Trump become president of the United States. Finally, Do you agree with me that finding her liable criminally would be inconsistent with stopping Donald Trump? If they found Hillary Clinton was criminally liable, that paves the way for Donald Trump. Why did they change gross negligence in the original statement, Director Wray, to reckless disregard?
I think I would defer to the Inspector General who looked into that.
Why did they do that?
The explanation was that.
Can I just suggest something?
Yeah.
Gross negligent is a criminally liable standard.
Correct.
So if they had said it the way they originally wrote it, she's guilty of a crime, and the reason they changed it is because she's not guilty of a crime, and if you want to stop him, it can't be gross negligence. What's the difference between reckless disregard and gross negligence?
Not much.
It's a lot politically.
Right.
Thank you.
Senator Coons would be next, so I guess we'll go with Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I can't let this afternoon pass, Director Wray, without saying to you how grateful we should all be for the men and women who work for you, who put their lives on the line, whose integrity and dedication to our nation are in no way affected by anything in this report. And I still have on my wall my seal from the Department of Justice of decades ago when I was United States Attorney, and I know that the men and women of the FBI work hard every day to uphold those ideals, and I want to thank you for your response, which is to make the FBI even better and avoid any repetition of a small number of agents and attorneys casting a cloud on the integrity of the FBI. So thank you for your response so far.
Thank you, Senator.
Director Horowitz, if I were President Trump and I held up this document to you and I said, sitting here right now, this report totally exonerates me, it shows no collusion, no obstruction of justice, what would you say to me?
Senator, I'd answer as I did before, which is the report covers the mid-year investigation. It touches on the Russia investigation in connection with the Wiener laptop matter, and that's what this was concerning.
And I want to thank you for the work on this report, and I respect your basically avoiding my question. I know that you're playing by norms and rules that apply to the Department of Justice, but you're dealing with the President of the United States that has no respect for those norms and rules. And he is distorting this report. He is weaponizing it to discredit the special counsel and to really undermine the rule of law in the United States of America. And he's using your report to do it. So I would just respectfully suggest that all of us have a responsibility to state the truth and speak that truth to power, which in this case happens to be one of the most powerful men on earth, when he lies about it, because it gravely threatens the rule of law. And I know you're playing by the rules, but he isn't. Let me ask you, Director Wray, the effect of these leaks from the New York office to Rudolph Giuliani was the subject of a letter that I wrote to you on May 8th. I don't know whether you have seen it or have it in mind. Basically, it asks you what is being done to assure there are no continuing unauthorized disclosures to Rudolph Giuliani, who now, just to state the elephant in the room, is the president's lawyer. Can you assure the American people that there are no ongoing leaks from any office of the FBI to Rudolph Giuliani?
Well, Senator, I'm certainly not aware of any. We are aggressively investigating a number of leaks, even as we speak. As I mentioned earlier, we have a dedicated unit that I stood up to focus on that. We have a new media policy that makes the rules unmistakably clear to everyone in every office. We have a disciplinary arm that is well regarded as being one of the toughest but fairest out there, and we intend to use all those things to make sure that everybody in every office follows the rules regarding leaks.
Well, if you would, I would appreciate a response to the letter, we have received none yet, that provides some more specific assurance that there are no ongoing leaks, because these leaks had a very practical effect. And we state the timeline in the letter. Rudolph Giuliani said on October 26, 2016, that he expected a surprise in the next few days. 2 days later, Director Comey issued his letter, and he did it in large part, and I'm quoting his general counsel, because they felt it would leak, those emails would leak if he didn't write the letter. And then Rudolph Giuliani said, when asked about whether or not he knew about the letter, "You're darned right, I did." So the practical effect on Director Comey's decision to do that letter was very, very tangible. I want to go to another impact of the leaks and ask you about them. We now know that Mr. Giuliani was not the only recipient of leaks designed to hurt Hillary Clinton. Representative Nunes recently admitted that FBI personnel secretly informed him in September of 2016 when Clinton emails were found on Anthony Weiner's laptop. He's admitted that fact. And they did it just days after the emails were discovered. So there was a leak to him. The timing and context of this disclosure strongly suggests that the goal was, in fact, of this FBI leaker, to give an outspoken Trump ally politically sensitive and highly secret information to use for political purposes. Representative Nunes appears to have recognized this fact because he never told any of his Democratic colleagues on the Intelligence Committee about it. Can you assure us that there are no ongoing leaks or unauthorized disclosure to Representative Nunes or anyone else in the House Intelligence Committee?
Well, Senator, again, I'm not, as I said before, I'm not aware of any ongoing leaks to any member of Congress or to the media.
And you would
I find
take
all.
action.
I would absolutely, if I was aware of a leak, I would take appropriate action. I don't want to cast aspersions on the New York field office, which I think is one of our best offices. But I don't condone leaks anywhere to anyone, and I don't really care what the motivation is, no matter how altruistic it might be. Leaks are wrong, and we need to be tough on them.
And I want to join you in the respect that I share for the New York field office and, as I stated earlier, for the FBI. Generally, General Horowitz, the comments that we have all said are unacceptable and abhorrent from Peter Strzok and Lisa Page were not the only inappropriate texts. In fact, there were comments that were disparaging about Hillary Clinton, were there not, that you found in your report?
We have put in there other examples of texts, including other individuals beyond.
In fact, there were slurs by FBI agents against Hillary Clinton, one saying, for example, that urged colleagues in the FBI to continue investigating Clinton to, quote, get that, I'm not going to articulate the word here, but there were slurs against her from other FBI agents.
I think that recounts what the general counsel said he had heard, so I don't think that's from these text messages.
It's not a direct quote, but it is something that was heard.
That was something the general counsel FBI general counsel relayed to us.
Senator Crable.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to go first to you, Mr. Horowitz. A lot of discussion has gone on back and forth here about whether bias has been found and what that bias was. You have indicated that your report has not found documentary or oral testimony or evidence showing bias in the charging decisions. Is that correct? How would you put it?
Yes. So as to the charging decisions, that's correct because they were made by the prosecutors, not the individuals, obviously, who were the agents, whose texts we were concerned about. And in addition, as to the specific investigative decisions we looked at. We also made clear we didn't look at all the decisions in the report. And I'll add, when we got to October, we had concerns that there may be bias impacting the decision to prioritize the Russia investigation over.
So what you're talking about is what prosecutors did with the report. You're not talking about whether there was bias in the recommendation not to prosecute, are you?
Correct.
And you're not saying you didn't find bias. For example, in the emails we've been having a lot of discussion about here.
I think it's clear from certainly the text messages we've talked about with regard to Mr. Strzok that he had, as we say here, a biased state of mind.
And as I understand from reading the report, not only Mr. Strzok, but a number of those who you found concerning comments being made by expressed remorse, said that they intended for these to be private conversations, and then said that it didn't have anything to do with the way that they did their job. Is that correct?
That was their explanations.
And what you're telling us is that you don't have any different evidence than that. You're not saying you believe it or not. You're saying that you don't have different evidence.
Correct.
I think that's a lot different than saying there's no bias, personally. Secondly, you did say, I believe, somewhere in the report that with regard to the charging decision, since that decision was made not by those who you found the bias from, but by others, and this would be prosecutors, not FBI agents, correct?
Correct.
That you felt that whatever bias they had, at least as to the charging decision, did not flow through. Even though, can you say that that's true, even though in this case the director of the FBI gave a charging recommendation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would use the same language you did, Senator, which is we didn't see evidence of that in the documentary or testimony that we received.
Well, I personally believe that there was plenty of evidence, although it may be circumstantial, that the recommendation made by the director of the FBI was influenced by bias. Mm-hmm. Would you agree with that?
Speaking of political bias, we didn't see that back in July from the FBI director in terms of why he made his decision to make the public statement he did.
Well, and I understand that tell me if I'm getting this right. What you're telling us is you found bias. Those who you found the bias among said, well, we didn't let it bleed into our work performance, and you don't have evidence to disprove that.
Correct. And we also said that it cast a cloud over the work that was done. We also said it sowed doubt about the investigation.
All right, thank you. And that gets me to the next thing, and I'll move to you, Mr. Ray, Director Ray, and that's the leaks. There's been a lot of talk here about the leaks. I don't have time to quote it now because my time's running out too fast, but if I understand, well, let me go back to you for a minute, Mr. Horowitz. You indicated that you have found, I've looked at Appendix G and H. I would recommend everyone look at Appendix G and H to see sort of pictorially or graphically what it is you're talking about. But although I accept what you say, Director, that this is not a reflection on the entire FBI, it's a big deal in terms of numbers and in terms of the issue that is at stake here. So, again, back to you, Director Ray. You indicated that you have adopted a new rule in November. What is the new rule? What is, quickly, if you could?
Well, there are a number of parts to the new rule, but the most important of which is to make clear that only a very select number of people within the organization are allowed to talk to the media without permission. And number two, and I'm oversimplifying it in the interest of time, and number two, that any contacts from the media to anybody else have to get reported. So that way you can't have somebody say, well, they contacted me, I didn't know. What I want to be clear on is that everybody understands the rules are crystal clear so that then if we find violations, it makes it much easier and more efficient, if you will, to make sure that we're holding people accountable.
And there will be stiff penalties.
Absolutely.
Some of the penalties could be criminal charges depending on what's disclosed, correct?
Could well be.
you indicated you have created a leak investigation unit. I think that's very critical. Again, could you briefly tell us exactly what you're doing there?
Well, that leak unit, as you alluded to, sometimes leaks are criminal and sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're just awful but not criminal. And so one of the ways in which leaks can be most clearly a concern under the criminal laws is in the context of classified information. And so that leak unit that I'm talking about is really targeted very specifically on anything that has to do with leaks of classified information, mishandling, et cetera.
Well, I appreciate that. I would recommend to you that you may want to have a leak investigation unit for non-classified leaks because there are serious problems when those happen as well. With the time I've got left, I think I'd like to change topics once more and go back to the meeting between Hillary Clinton and between Bill Clinton and Loretta Lynch on the tarmac in Phoenix. And Mr. Horowitz, you indicated, once again, I think your language was that, well, you indicated that the meeting was not an accidental meeting, but unplanned. Is that correct?
Correct.
How do you know it was unplanned?
Based on the records we reviewed, at least from the Attorney General's side,
yes,
is what we were speaking to. We didn't see any evidence, as you would expect to see through the Attorney General's details, security, et cetera, that was about to occur. I obviously don't have authority or access over other records, and I rely on what we were told by the witnesses.
That's kind of what I'm getting at. It's sort of the same thing with regard to the witnesses who you identified who had bias. They said, well, we didn't really express that bias. And what you're saying here, isn't it, is that you haven't got the evidence as to whether it was planned or not.
We have, what I would say is from the Attorney General's side of it, based on the reactions of the staff, how it played out, it appeared to us that they didn't have any reason to think there was a plan for a meeting.
Well, some of us think it's quite coincidental, if you will, that the Attorney General and the former president would both end up in the same place on the tarmac in Phoenix. My time is run. Thank you.
Yeah. I would just to explain that a little, there is a, as you know, discussion in here, and I encourage folks to look at that and see how that meeting played out, particularly with the staff.
All right.
Thank you. Director Wray, would you agree that there is that this report has no bearing on whether the FBI is capable of conducting its role in the Mueller investigation?
I don't think this report speaks to the special counsel investigation.
Thank you. And then General Horowitz, this past December, 6 months before the IG, your report was released, the Justice Department invited a group of reporters in to view the text messages that have been discussed here from the two FBI agents. And I'm concerned, I think many of us are concerned about what seems to be a selective disclosure of parts of the report at that time. It is clear that at that time, at least the investigation had not been completed, and therefore the disclosure of parts of the report were without the public having the full context of the findings of the report. Do you believe that to be, that press conference, holding it when it was held, to be atypical of the department's practices as it relates to revealing information to the public?
Frankly, I don't have all the details of how that occurred. I know, in fact, it did occur. We made clear we were not consulted beforehand. I will say on the question of whether they're appropriate to send them to Congress or not is something I did testify to and speak to, because I think that's a different question.
That's
As
right. And
Director Ray said, there's legitimate oversight.
Right. My question is about the press conference that was held.
Right.
And do you believe it to be consistent with the department's general practice, the Department of Justice?
You know, I'd have to talk with folks there. I'm not sure I'm in a position to give an opinion without understanding more as to what their rationale was for why they did that. We have not investigated or looked.
Will you open an investigation into the cause and the reasons for that press conference? And also an investigation into who called for that press conference and what those reasons were?
Senator, I believe there might be Privacy Act litigation going on. I'm not sure. I'd want to look at that. As you know, we don't step into the middle of active matters. So let me look at that and be happy to speak with you further and your staff further about it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And Is there anything in this report to suggest that the FBI is incapable of conducting current or future investigations in a fair and impartial manner?
No, not at all. We speak to this report, to this matter.
And is there anything in your report to suggest that Special Counsel Mueller is not able to partner with the FBI to conduct his investigation in a fair and impartial manner?
I would just echo what Director Ray said. This report covers the Clinton email review.
Thank you. And on June 5th, 2018, the President tweeted, quote, "Why is it taking so long for the Inspector General's report on Crooked Hillary and Slippery James Comey?" In that same tweet, he implied he knew about the substance of the report and stated, quote, "There are so many horrible things to tell, the public has a right to know." On June 14th, the report was released to the public. When was the report completed?
The report's completed when we release it. Just
the same day that it was released?
The day we, as per usual practice, the day before the report is released publicly, we provide it to the department and, in this case, the FBI.
Did you provide it to the White House?
We do not do that.
Did you direct that it should or should not be
We
shared
don't
with the White House?
direct the department. The department has to make that conclusion. The FBI has to make that conclusion. Every report is different and stands on its own, and we've had instances, as I could testify to, in terms of, for example, Fast and Furious. There was disclosures to the White House about it for various reasons. That can be there can be a basis to do it. I think it's something you'd have to direct the department for an answer.
And was the report completed then? I think you've said this, but I'd like clarification. Was your report completed, or was there any draft disclosed to any agency outside of your IG's office before or on June 5th of 2018?
So following, again, our normal practice, as we do in every report and as we did in this report, we provide a draft copy of it to the department, and again, in this case, the FBI, to review, and this was in mid-May, to review and to provide us with what we call a review to determine whether there's, for example, grand jury, Title III, other information in it, classified information that would be inappropriate to be public. In fact, in this case, there was, and at our request, the department went to court and got unsealing orders so that what you see here is unredacted and full.
When you shared that information in May, did it include your findings?
It includes our full draft, and to the question asked earlier, did anybody pressure us to make changes that softened, weakened, changed the findings? We were not pressured in any way to do that. We followed our usual practice.
Were you requested to change the findings in any way?
We are asked routinely by people that are commented in here and others to
Let's talk about this case, if you don't mind.
I am talking about this case. We allow individuals as well to look at this.
Did anyone in the White House ask you to change?
We had no communications at all with the White House.
Okay. And then, Director Ray, you've talked, many of us have talked about the duties and responsibilities and ethics of a prosecutor. I appreciate that you are enjoying not being a practicing lawyer anymore. But I'd like to ask you, the report aptly notes that, quote, criticizing individuals for conduct that does not warrant prosecution is something that the department simply does not do. As a former prosecutor, as a citizen, as the director of the FBI, do you agree that when Director Comey concluded that Secretary Clinton's conduct did not amount to a prosecutable offense, that he should have refrained from making any public critique or commentary?
Well, Senator, as I said earlier, I think the policies the department has governing commenting publicly about uncharged conduct are there for a good reason. In addition to having been a prosecutor, a line prosecutor, the head of the criminal division, I've also been a defense attorney, so I've also had clients that are impacted by those policies and norms, and I think those policies and norms are there for a reason, and I would expect to follow them.
Great. And I appreciate the point you made earlier about the new policies that you've put in place, and I join the comments made by many of my colleagues in praising and thanking the men and women of your agency for the work that they do. And much of that work has happened with local law enforcement in California, and on behalf of them, I thank you for that.
Thank you.
You also mentioned a number of, and the report mentions a number of recommendations. So, Director Ray, I'm just going to ask you for the record, if you'll commit to, one, enforcing the policy that prohibits the department and its employees from publicly discussing the conduct of uncharged individuals.
Yes, that's part of our remedial action in response to this.
And will you also commit to enforcing the Department of Justice policy that explicitly prohibits the department and its employees from taking investigative steps that could impact an election?
Well, I think we would follow department policy on that, and I would expect our folks to. My understanding from the Inspector General's report is that there may be room for the department to be a little more clear about exactly what that policy is. Mm-hmm. There is a pretty long-standing norm that applies to it, but whether the policies themselves are clear enough, I think, is up to debate, and I think we would work with the department and follow whatever the policy is.
Thank you, and then if you could follow up with the committee, that would be great. Thank you. I have nothing else.
Senator Kennedy.
General, couple of brief questions first. Can we agree that the FBI is the premier law enforcement agency in the history of ever?
I will say one of them, since I oversee multiple law enforcement.
Can we agree that the FBI has about 37,000 employees?
Yes.
Can we agree that there were and perhaps still are a small minority of bad apples at the FBI?
I think in any large organization you're going to find problems.
Can we agree that Director Wray has the will, ability, and authority to find those bad apples and terminate their employment with extreme prejudice?
Yes, and we work closely with Director Wray and have a very good relationship.
And refer them for prosecution if necessary.
That's correct, or to the IG for investigation.
Can we agree that Mr. Comey, while he was FBI director, was intentionally subordinate?
Yes.
Can we agree that insubordination, particularly intentional insubordination, it can be a symptom of managerial bias?
It could be.
Did you find that Mr. Comey was unbiased or biased and did not act on his bias?
We found no evidence that he was politically biased. That was what we were looking at and asked to look at in the requests we got.
Can we agree that bias is a state of mind?
Yes.
Can we agree that the only person who truly knows that person's state of mind is that person unless he's insane?
Yes, or memorializes it or tells somebody about it in some way.
Did you find any indication that Mr. Comey was or is insane?
No, we did not.
Okay. Are you referring Mr. Comey for prosecution?
There is no referral here as to him.
Could a U.S. attorney who might have jurisdiction decide to prosecute?
The department as a whole can look at this report and take whatever action it deems appropriate.
Okay, if an FBI agent lies to the FBI, that's insubordination too, isn't it?
It's a clear violation of rules, and I think you could characterize it as insubordinate for failing to follow the rules.
Like Mr. McCabe?
I'm going to refrain from speaking about that and let our report speak for itself.
Okay, well, so Mr. McCabe, who is insubordinate, gets referred for prosecution, but Mr. Comey, who is insubordinate, doesn't get referred, but he gets to keep his pension and his book deals. Is that about the deal?
Well, I'll just add, well before we finish this report, Mr. Comey had been terminated and so was no longer at the FBI.
Right, but he could still be prosecuted.
In theory, yes.
Okay. I want to read you some of the emails and text messages that came out of your report. These were all emails, instant messages, and text messages by senior members of the FBI. They were involved in the Clinton email investigation, the Russian investigation, the Mueller investigation, and in some cases, all three. 8/16/2015, Peter Strzok, quote, Bernie Sanders is an idiot like Trump. 2/12/2016, Lisa Page, I'm no prude, but I'm really appalled by this, so you don't go looking in case you haven't heard. Trump called him the P word. The man has no dignity or class. He simply cannot be president. 2/12/16, Peter Strzok, oh, Trump's abysmal. I keep hoping the charade will end and people will just dump him. The problem then is Rubio will likely lose to Cruz. 3316, Lisa Page, God, Trump is a loathsome human. 3316, Peter Strzok, oh my God, Trump is an idiot. 3316, Lisa Page. Also, did you hear Trump made a comment about the size of his, I'm not going to use the word, it rhymes with wang doodle. The size of his D earlier. This man cannot be president. Day after the election, 11/9/2016, FBI employee, quote, all the people who were initially voting for her would not and were not swayed by any decision the FBI put out. Trump supporters are all poor to middle class, uneducated, lazy pieces of S that think he will magically grant them jobs for doing nothing. They probably didn't watch the debates, aren't fully educated on his policies, and are stupidly wrapped up in his unmerited enthusiasm. 11/8/2016, you think, by FBI Agent 1, you think HRC is going to win, right? You think we should get some nails and boards in case she doesn't? Same day, FBI Agent 5, she better win, otherwise I'm going to be walking around with both of my guns. Day after the election, 11/9/2016, FBI Attorney 2, I am numb. FBI Attorney 2 later, same day, I am so stressed about what I could have done differently. Last one. Day after the election, FBI Attorney 2, I just can't imagine the systematic disassembly of the progress we have made over the last 8 years. The Affordable Care Act is gone. Who knows if the rhetoric about deporting people, walls, and crap is true? Honestly feel like there's going to be a lot more gun issues, too. General, do you believe in the Tooth Fairy?
Nope.
Do you believe in the Easter Bunny?
Nope.
Do you believe that Jimmy Hoffa died of natural causes?
Not based on what I've read.
Do you honestly believe that the American people are going to look at this report and look at those emails and not believe that there was bias and people acting on bias and that the fix was in at the FBI?
I completely understand the concern, Senator, and that's why we've laid all this out here, and that's why we found that it impacts the credibility of the handling of the investigation. And what we say here is not, as Senator Crapo mentioned, which is that there was no bias, but rather what we were asked to look at was whether the specific decisions we reviewed were affected by bias. And those particular decisions here that we're talking about were decisions made mostly by the prosecutors, not by any of the individuals you just indicated there, and where there was that concern, which was in October, where Agent Strzok was in fact a decision maker. It's precisely why we found the concern we found.
Let me stop you, because if I go now, I can get in one more question.
Go ahead.
Your classified index.
Yes.
Does it contain or discuss an email that refers to a conversation allegedly between Attorney General Lynch and a person by the name of Amanda Renteria?
I'm not sure what I can say about that publicly, given the matter's classified. So I would ask you if I can get back to you on that. I'm hesitant to say anything in the public forum about that.
Would you allow our chairman and our ranking member to see the classified index?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, what we are trying to do, Senator, is what ended up happening is because of the nature of the information in there, it was classified at such a high level by the intelligence community. We don't make that decision by the intelligence community, that it limited even the members who can see it, as well as the staffs. And what we're doing right now is, and I asked the Deputy Attorney General's office to help facilitate this, is to go back to the intelligence community and let us know how we can address whatever caused this to be classified at that high level so that we can make sure that we can write it at a level and get it to the members, including as to the question you raise, promptly. And they told us they are doing that. We very much want the committee to see this information.
Yours was a very professional report. Don't agree with all the conclusions, but I want to thank you for that.
I appreciate it.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Director Ray. Thank you for sticking up for your organization. And Inspector General Horowitz, thank you for the thoroughness with which you discharged your duties here. I want to go back to something that's been touched on here because I really want to hammer it home. There are prosecutors and investigators all over this country who look up to you, who looked up to Director Comey, and who take a lesson from what they see. When I heard Director Comey extemporize derogatory investigative information about an uncharged person, I was stunned. Director Comey, you've said that the rules against that are there for a reason. Just to make it perfectly clear, could I ask each of you to say, what is the reason that we do not want prosecutors to be discharging derogatory information about uncharged persons?
Senator, my understanding has always been that the purpose behind those rules and norms is that prosecutors speak through charging documents, and that the reason for that is because then the individuals who are charged have an opportunity to have their day in court and defend themselves, whereas public statements about uncharged conduct don't afford that opportunity.
They could move over the line into smearing as opposed into proper judicial conduct, proper investigative and prosecutorial conduct.
It could.
And in fact, even where there is a charged person, do you not disclose derogatory investigative information only through pleadings and arguments, and you would not approve of a press conference just adding in some derogatory investigative information outside of the proper channels of the prosecution?
In the charged conduct context, we try very hard to make sure that our public statements stay within the four corners of the charging documents until the case has reached a conclusion, and then maybe we'd be talking about the evidence at trial or something like that.
Mr. Horowitz?
In fact, as you know, as having been a U.S. attorney, what was interesting as we went and did this review is there is a department rule that makes clear that the department can't speak publicly about an unindicted co-conspirator. In other words, an individual about whom the department has concluded is in fact a co-conspirator in a criminal enterprise but wasn't charged.
And there's a
but
reason.
It doesn't have a rule about an individual who's never charged. And that's why we make the recommendation.
But instead it has that norm, and that norm was what Director Comey violated. I don't believe that if he had not violated that norm, he would have ever been up testifying in Congress. It is bizarre to have the director of the FBI testifying in Congress about a case, particularly one that may continue. And I don't think if he'd stuck to the rules, there would have been anything for Congress to look into. He just would have said, we don't discuss cases, we don't discuss investigative information, we worked hard, we made the finding that we made, and that's the end of it. And if he hadn't had all that conversation up in Congress, I don't think he would have felt the same way about the Wiener laptop information, and that second disclosure of derogatory investigative information would not have taken place. So, for want of a nail, all of this unraveled, I think, to the great detriment of Director Comey's reputation, which had been very good, and to the reputation of the FBI, I'm sorry to say, and I thank you for your efforts to have to put this back together, Director Ray. If political advantage to President Trump, then candidate Trump, was not Director Comey's motivation in making those statements, And if its corollary, political damage to Secretary Clinton, was not Director Comey's motive in making that statement on July 5th, what was, to the best of your knowledge?
Well, what we describe here is his explanation being that he thought there needed to be unusual transparency given the unusual nature of the case, the high profile of the case, and his belief that the integrity of the FBI and the Justice Department depended on being able to stand out there and explain what the decision was, why the decision was made, and that he was uniquely situated to be able to do that.
Did you find that credible?
That he believed that, yes.
That he was right about that?
That he was right about that, no. As we lay out here, that's the responsibility of the Attorney General or the Deputy Attorney General. The highest ranking, whether it's the U.S. Attorney, the highest ranking prosecutor has to make that decision. Under our system, they're the ones who are accountable to the public, to this committee, to the organization.
Did you come across any evidence that would refute the notion that he was concerned about his own reputation and wanted to look balanced in going about this rather than following the rules?
We got a variety of testimony, to be fair, on that. That was in various places as to why he did what he did, the integrity of the FBI and the organization, and really a series of explanations from individuals as to what they believed.
Director Wray, a general question. When should criminal investigations be wrapped up?
It's hard to answer that in a general way. I think when the work is done, is the most shorthanded way of putting it.
How often is legislative opinion about when a criminal investigation should be wrapped up a proper factor to consider in wrapping up the investigation?
It's hard for me to think of a situation where that's a factor we would consider.
I can't think of one either. I agree with you. How often is a subject's lawyer's opinion on when an investigation should be wrapped up a proper factor to determine the wrapping up of a criminal investigation?
That one's even harder for me to imagine.
Yeah. And in fact, I suspect it would be pretty hard for United States Attorney Giuliani to imagine when he was going after Anthony Salerno for years if Anthony Salerno's lawyers had said to him, it's been a year, time to wrap it up. I just wanted to put that context out there. Finally, with respect to obstruction of justice, which you've said is something that should be taken extremely serious at the federal level, official acts can be evidence of obstruction of justice, correct?
Well, I think that's a legal question that I'll leave to the lawyers.
Would you stop an obstruction of justice investigation if it involved an official act, or would you continue to investigate? That's no bar to proceeding on an obstruction of justice claim, is it? Because the obstruction was also an official act?
Well, again, I'd have to look at the law on the subject, but my impression is that if we had evidence that suggested there was a possible violation of the obstruction statutes, we would continue to investigate it until we'd reached a conclusion.
And a lawyer for a subject can obstruct justice?
A lawyer for a subject can obstruct justice?
A subject of an investigation can obstruct justice in the investigation, correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, my time's up.
Senator Sass. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you both for being here. Mr. Horowitz, can you remind us who Cheryl Mills and Heather Samuelson are?
Ms. Mills was a counselor at the State Department during Secretary Clinton's tenure, and Ms. Samuelson was also in her front office.
And why do they show up in your report?
Well, for several reasons. On the one hand, after they left the State Department and Secretary Clinton left the State Department, they culled through Secretary Clinton's emails to decide which ones they concluded were work-related and which ones weren't. And the ones they concluded were work-related were ultimately forwarded to the State Department, so they were involved in that process. In addition, they appear, as we describe here, at Secretary Clinton's interview on July 2nd, representing her as her lawyer.
So they have professional relationships in the government, professional relationships outside the government, compensated as lawyers, personal relationships and political relationships, and they're allowed to accompany Secretary Clinton to her interview. How can that be?
Well, we describe in here what the rationale that was given to us. As we lay out here, we think it was inconsistent with normal investigative procedure, and we're concerned about it.
Were they ultimately involved in expunging evidence and information that was criminal?
They were ultimately involved in instructing individuals to remove, destroy what they had concluded were non-work-related emails. I'll leave it to others to decide what that meant as a legal matter.
So were they ever a target of investigation themselves, Ms. Mills or Ms. Samuelson?
From our review here, what we were told was that the only individual considered for a potential charging decision was Secretary Clinton. As we noted here, actually nobody was listed as a subject of this investigation at any point in time.
Can you think of any other investigation that has no subject of the investigation?
I think you probably could have a circumstance. I'd leave it to Director Wray, although in this case where it was a focus, there was a focus of some idea of who was the individual or individuals that were involved in the events. That would be surprising, but again, I would defer to the Director.
Director Wray, can you give me an example of any investigation like this where people who are potentially involved in the destruction of criminal evidence would be allowed to accompany a supposed subject of an investigation but not named target subject of an investigation? Any example anywhere like that?
It's hard for me to come up with one. It's my experience, subjects don't usually accompany each other to interviews.
I asked Director Comey about this in a hearing in, I think, probably spring, summer of 2016 on the Homeland Security Committee, and he said that when you're trying to get information out of a witness who maybe, or a subject, I don't remember the term, the noun he actually used, but when you're trying to get information and you're trying to compel them, and it may take a long time if you have to subpoena them, you would do things like this. Can you think of any examples like that?
Well, again, I've already testified to my experience. I'm reluctant ever to speak in terms of something never, ever happening, because in my experience, there are very few absolutes in this world, but certainly the norm would be what I described.
It's truly bizarre. Mr. Horowitz, can you tell us about President Obama's comments on the investigation of Hillary Clinton's emails in the spring and summer of 2016?
Yeah, there were several occasions when either President Obama or his press secretary made comments about the Clinton email investigation, and as we describe here, that raised concerns by both the investigative team and the Attorney General and the prosecutors. And as we also describe here, it's one of the reasons cited to us by Director Comey for his belief that he had to, in essence, go it alone and make the announcement he had to make that he made on July 5.
I think many of us on both sides of the aisle are concerned about the erosion of norms, about Article 2 officials commenting on ongoing investigations. I think it's a terrible thing in 2017 and 2018. I think it was a terrible thing in 2016. Can you tell us a little bit inside the culture of the Department of Justice? Was there a sense that the President of the United States commenting on an ongoing investigation was a problem? Did the Attorney General's office know that this was a problem?
It was a concern. We describe in here in detail what the reaction was, which was surprise and concern. And in fact, the Attorney General and the Justice Department reached out to the White House to find out how did this occur, why did it occur, and that it couldn't continue to occur.
And that's General Lynch, I assume, at that time.
That's correct.
And so General Lynch then would seemingly be a person who wants to guard the integrity of these norms, and yet she's meeting with the former President of the United States, the husband of someone being investigated, even if not named as a subject. And once she had crossed this line of having sat on the tarmac with President Clinton, what steps did she then take?
So at that point, she went to the department ethics officer for a ethics opinion on whether it required her to recuse, which, as you know, is one step, but there is two parts. There is the mandatory recusal, and the laws are very, I'll call narrow as to that. There's also the permissive recusal provisions, but she went and got an opinion as to whether she was required to recuse. She decided that she would not recuse on the permissive basis. And then publicly announced on July 1st what her role would be going forward. And as we describe here, we found it confusing and unclear what she was telling the public her role would ultimately be, because on the one hand, she was saying that she, following her normal practice, would hear the recommendations and fully intended to accept the recommendation. On the other hand, was saying she would accept the recommendation. So not clear what that meant, since there are potential conflicts between those two.
Not clear to the Bureau, not clear to the prosecutors who are supposed to be making these decisions, and not clear to the public and to the press.
Correct.
Shifting gears, I only have a little bit of time left. Director Wray, you've said you're going to institute new training about leaks inside the Bureau. Kudos, thank you. It's clearly necessary. Can you give the layman's summary on what individual FBI officials and FBI agents are allowed to talk to the press about? When and why?
It's hard to put it all in one thumbnail. Certainly there are things like got to stick within the charging documents, as we talked about before. Wouldn't talk about ongoing investigations publicly. But I think there are situations where we would talk about, an arrest that's been made, for example. You often see an SAC in a field office do a press conference together with partners announcing an arrest. So those are some of the kinds of situations. But the reason we've had a very specific, very detailed policy is to make sure that everybody understands what those rules are. And one of the things that's clear to me is that now, having put the new policy in place, we need to pound home the importance of following that policy. I want to be in a situation where everybody in our organization understands exactly what the rules are, so that A, the 99.9% of them that follow them, and B, the remaining percent, it's very easy to pursue an appropriate investigation and discipline if that's what's warranted.
The chairman's going to gavel me out, so let me just say, Director Wray, we're glad you're there. Your agency is incredibly important to the American people, and there's been a massive breach of public trust, and it needs to be restored, and I think there are a lot of people pulling for you in your calling.
Senator Arano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Horowitz, you just testified just now that President Obama's comments about the Clinton investigation in 2015 caused you concern. So you must be very concerned about President Trump's ongoing comments about the current Mueller investigation, including his thoughts about his pardon powers.
What I said was, as we laid out here, the comments of President Obama at the time were of concern to the people doing the investigating. So frankly, what we were looking at is what individuals told us. I'm not going to speak to what the reaction would be in the FBI or elsewhere with regard to current concerns. Frankly, the director can speak to that question better than I.
So, Director, do you have concerns about the President Trump's ongoing comments about the Mueller investigation, including his use of his pardon powers?
Senator, there are an awful lot of opinions being expressed out there on an awful lot of topics about our work. What I try to make sure our folks are focused on is the work itself and following the rules. And I will add that there's a reason why I always say that we are going to do our work independently and objectively, no matter who likes it.
Thank you. That's very reassuring. Unfortunately, these kinds of ongoing comments do sway the public. When Director Comey came before this committee on May 3rd, and he was fired on May 9th, some of us on this committee, including myself, questioned why he made all those derogatory and highly prejudicial comments about Hillary at his press conference in July. So, Director Wray, I want to make sure, commenting publicly about unchargeable conduct is not FBI policy then or now, correct?
Senator, I'm not aware of any policy that permitted it at the time, but as I said, we're working on policies to make even more clear things that may have been less clear before.
Good, thank you. Mr. Horowitz, I'd like to follow up on your answer to Senator Graham about the difference between gross negligence and extremely careless. You said it was just a political difference, but that's not true. There's a legal difference. In fact, you spent a few pages of your report explaining the difference, and you made clear how unified your team was on its early decision, or the FBI team. was on its early decision that there was no evidence that Senator Clinton intentionally or willfully mishandled classified information. And if she had, that would be what they would have considered gross negligence. So your answer to Senator Graham made it sound as if the determination that Senator Clinton did not have the requisite intent necessary for a criminal charge was a close call and a late call, but that was not the case. I'd like to give you a chance to correct that misimpression.
That certainly wasn't my intention in leaving that impression. I think the concern that we highlight here is that by drafting a statement where he said he believed there was gross negligence and turning it into extremely careless, it was precisely the concern that many people commented on, which is people viewed it as close and roughly one and the same. I understand that the former has a legal meaning and the latter doesn't. But to the public at large, that was the concern that the prosecutors and others had about his comment.
I think it was really important for Director Comey to be very careful in the use of these kinds of terms. I mean, not to mention that he should never have editorialized in such a way to begin with. And really, the showing that needed to happen for any kind of criminal prosecution of Senator Clinton was that there had to be a requisite intent, and there was no requisite intent. So in my view, when Director Comey, even when he said extremely careless, I think that was being very careless on his part. I wanted to go on to something else that was brought out at this hearing. One of my colleagues said earlier that clearly Strzok did not want Donald Trump elected. If that is true, and this is for either one of you, if that is true, why do you think that he did not leak any information about the Trump-Russian investigation that was also ongoing during the time of the 2016 election? Care to comment?
The argument he made to us as to why there was evidence he wasn't biased is precisely that argument. I don't think that necessarily closes off the bias question simply because he didn't violate a rule regarding leaking, though.
Well, the fact is that the public did not know that there was an investigation over Russia's attempts to interfere with our elections or any of the Trump team's involvement with those Russian efforts. So reasonable people could conclude, and I conclude that the bottom line is that Russia and Comey helped to elect Trump. And Russia did its part by sowing discord among Americans, spreading lies about Hillary Clinton, and offering help to the Trump family and campaign at every turn. And Comey pitched in by keeping the FBI investigation into the Trump-Russia situation a secret, while publicly trashing Secretary Clinton in July and reopening the investigation in late October, even though Comey knew about the Weiner emails a full month before finally coming out with publicly that he was going to basically reopen the Clinton investigation. So as far as reasonable people could conclude, James Comey tipped the scales further in Trump's favor. Is there anything in your report that argues against this reasonable conclusion?
Senator, we don't go into the impact that had on the election. That's not something we would even have any ability or expertise to.
I'd say reasonable people could conclude that Russia and Comey helped to elect President Trump. And in fact, during the time of the election, candidate Trump, was very happy with what was going on with Comey, and in fact invited the Russians to engage in further efforts to go after Mrs. Clinton. So, I just want to know, there have been calls for a special counsel. This is for you, Mr. Horowitz. Should there be further investigations into what happened regarding the Clinton investigation?
As Inspector General, that's most clearly not my decision to make. And the last thing I'm going to do is step outside the authorities you've given me, the Congress, and the IG Act.
So you can't respond to that, Director Wray? Is there anything in this report that indicates that there should be another special counsel or further investigation of the Clinton matter?
Well, Senator, the decision about whether or not and when to appoint a special counsel is one that's reserved to the Attorney General or the Deputy Attorney General if the Attorney General is recused. And one of the key takeaways from this report is that the FBI Director shouldn't, as Inspector General Horowitz just said, get out of his lane. So I'm going to rely on that.
So has Deputy Director Rosenstein said to you that you should begin an investigation into the Clinton matter?
Senator, I can't comment on my conversations with the Deputy Attorney General about investigations.
Thank you.
I've been told that one Republican and one Democrat is going to still come for their first round, and so Senator Kennedy said he had one question, and Senator Whitehouse said he had one question. Normally, I didn't want to have a second round because I thought the vote's coming up and it would be close to the vote. So you go ahead, Senator Kennedy, with your one question, and Senator Whitehouse with his one question. And then if the others two don't show up, we're going to stop.
General Horowitz, I wanted to ask you about Assistant Attorney General Peter Kadzik. My understanding that Mr. Kadzik was an Assistant Attorney General. He attended all the senior staff meetings at Justice. At these senior staff meetings, the Attorney General was in attendance, and various investigations by the FBI were discussed. I also understand that Mr. Kadzik was a good friend of John Podesta. Mr. Podesta was President Obama's chief of staff, and he was chairman of the Hillary Clinton for President campaign, and that Mr. Kadzik also had worked for Governor Dukakis, Senator Walter Mondale, or Governor, Vice President Walter Mondale, and was involved in the Mark Rich pardon. Now, he asked the Clinton campaign for a job for his 24-year-old son. While that job request was pending, he sent Mr. Podesta a heads-up email about the release of Mrs. Clinton's emails. Is my understanding right?
It is.
Did you look at Mr. Kadzik's telecommunication devices to see if he had other communications with Mr. Podesta?
As I sit here, frankly, I don't recall. Let me get back to you on that.
Would you do that?
Absolutely.
Did you look at Mr. Podesta's telecommunication devices to see if he got other communications from Mr. Kadzik?
I don't believe we went to Mr. Podesta's communication devices as a third party.
Would you do that?
Let me talk with the team, and if I could get back to you on that.
Okay. Well, my point, not to put too fine a point on it, but he already was giving inside information to the chairman of the Hillary Clinton campaign. He did it once while his son's job request was pending. It would seem to me to be a reasonable possibility he did it other times as well. I'm not saying, I'm not alleging it. I just want to know. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Coons.
Thank you, Chairman Grassley, and thank you to our witnesses for your hard work and for what's been a long hearing. I want to begin by thanking you, Inspector General Horowitz, and your staff, the Director of the FBI, Mr. Wray, and the thousands of agents and DOJ professionals who are doing difficult, sometimes even dangerous jobs to investigate and prosecute crimes all over the country. The IG and FBI have demonstrated something very important today through this process and through this report, which is that our country's most senior leaders, our most senior law enforcement leaders, are subject to scrutiny for their conduct. It bears repeating that for this review, senior IG staff conducted over 100 interviews and reviewed over 1.2 million documents, including interviews with a former president, former attorney general, former FBI director. Frankly, that's something that wouldn't happen in a lot of other countries. And it makes me proud to be an American and proud to continue to support the rule of law. In the United States, even the most senior officials who make mistakes are held to account. In its review, the IG's office found former FBI director made serious errors in judgment in deviating from policies and releasing information about the Clinton investigation just before the 2016 election. It's important the American people understand that there are 37,000 hardworking FBI employees And the report takes issue with a few discrete decisions by just a handful of those employees. Even then, it finds decisions in the Clinton investigation were not the result of political bias. I'm encouraged DOJ and FBI are prepared to learn lessons from this report. One conclusion stood out to me. The IG found that FBI policies are, and I quote, most important to follow when the stakes are the highest and when the pressures to divert from them the greatest. Those include policies to avoid interference with ongoing investigations and even the appearance of a political bias. Director Wray, I've expressed time and again that I'm concerned the Department of Justice is being pressured to release information to Congress that could compromise the special counsel's ongoing investigation. I am all for oversight after the conclusion of an investigation, but I'd like to hear that you're committed to ensuring the Bureau will not risk interference with Special Counsel Mueller's ongoing criminal investigations by providing midstream information to Congress that risks leaking to the very subjects of that investigation. Could you give us that assurance today?
Senator, while on the one hand we are of course committed to cooperating with legitimate congressional oversight, and that's an important part of our responsibility, we are also committed and obligated to protect the integrity of ongoing criminal investigations, not just the one you mentioned, but others. We're also obligated to protect sources and methods. We're also obligated to do things like respect grand jury secrecy, which actually makes it illegal for us to share certain information. None of that is meant to suggest that we don't want to do everything we can, and in fact are doing everything we can to cooperate with the, I think, maybe 6 different committees of Congress that are investigating different ways related matters. We're providing mountains of information, briefings, interviews, reading room access, et cetera, and so we're doing everything we can to be responsive while at the same time making sure that we don't jeopardize ongoing criminal investigations, and that's something I'm committed to.
Thank you. Our president has repeatedly described the FBI's investigation into campaign activities in 2016. In fact, he did this earlier today, about 11:27 today, as a witch hunt. You and I both know the Justice Department has uncovered ongoing interference with our 2016 elections, has already charged 20 individuals and 3 companies with crimes. Trump campaign and administration officials have admitted to acting as undisclosed foreign agents for a pro-Russian political party and lying about conversations with the Russian ambassador, not to mention bank fraud, money laundering, tax crimes. I'll just ask you a conclusory question, if I might. Do you believe the investigation into Russia's interference in our 2016 election is important and should be completed without political interference?
Senator, I believe that Special Counsel Mueller is conducting an important investigation. I believe that the question of Russian interference with our election is something that needs to be taken very seriously, and the investigative work that's being done on that regard needs to be completed.
Thank you. Mr. Horowitz, I think you'd agree with me that even the appearance of political bias within an FBI investigation is problematic. Is that correct?
Correct.
So that's why your investigation found fault in an exchange of text messages that you identified that demonstrated some political bias. Is that right?
Correct.
So let me just point out, as I did, that our president routinely tweets about ongoing investigations in a way that criticizes them, critiques them, and is an attempt to undermine them. In my view, these remarks are also inappropriate efforts to politicize an ongoing federal investigation. Director Wray, the president's former campaign manager, Paul Manafort, is now in jail. He's been charged with 25 felonies, laundering tens of millions of dollars, committing tax fraud, encouraging witnesses to lie. President Trump has called this very unfair. Should the American people have faith that the Manafort investigation is being handled fairly?
Senator, I'm not going to speak for the Special Counsel's office. What I would say is that I expect all of our employees to conduct themselves professionally and fairly.
Does the FBI take the political opinions of FBI agents into account when choosing how to staff an investigation? Have political beliefs ever influenced either your work at the FBI or which agents are chosen for a particular investigation?
I don't use political litmus tests as a basis for choosing who works on investigations. I do think it is extremely important that all of our agents understand not just the importance of objectivity, but the appearance of objectivity. And to me, that means that we need to be focused on making sure that we're following our rules, following our processes, following what the Inspector General refers to as long-established norms, the safe place for us is in process and making sure that we follow the process and that we do that independently and objectively. No matter who likes the result, we'll be okay. But the important thing is to make sure that our process is bulletproof.
I couldn't agree more. Mr. Horowitz, President Trump has claimed FBI officials are biased against him and in favor of former Secretary Hillary Clinton. Let me just make sure I've understood this right. In your investigation, did you find the FBI took any investigative step based on political bias against the current president?
No. The one area where we were concerned about bias was in the October time period, and the weighing of Agent Strzok between focusing on the Russia investigation versus focusing on the Wiener laptop, and our concern about his decision given the text messages.
But did you conclude that that we should have concern about either the initiation or the ongoing conduct of the special counsel's investigation based on those texts?
We didn't look at the special counsel investigation as part of this review.
Last question to you, Mr. Horowitz. This report seems to vindicate the wisdom of many long-established DOJ policies and practices, the chain of command, the need to strictly comply with recusal. The department policies are in place for a reason, and it was wrong to deviate from them, and it would be wrong to deviate now. Do you agree that ad hoc deviations from established policies and procedures should be avoided?
I do, and I think that's partly one of the most important takeaways of this report.
Well, I appreciate the hard work you've both done and are continuing to do, and the confidence you are working to restore in the American people that these well-established, long-observed policies and procedures will be followed going forward. Today's hearing is a good reminder of why federal law enforcement and respect for the rule of law in the United States have been and should be the envy of the free world. I know it can be frustrating that we don't know what's happening in the ongoing special counsel investigation, but today's hearing reminds us that is exactly how sensitive ongoing law enforcement investigations should work. And I'm grateful for your continued efforts to protect the integrity of the FBI, the Department of Justice, and their important work, which makes us all safer. Thank you very much, Don.
Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for being here today. These are difficult days in the Department of Justice and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Both the Bureau and the Department have decades-long, in the Department's case, centuries-long traditions of fair and impartial administration of justice. There are thousands of good and honorable men and women that work at the Bureau, that work at the Department of Justice, and yet their integrity has been called into question by misconduct and political bias at the highest levels. On May 3rd, 2017, then Director Comey testified before this committee that he had, quote, never, and never was his words, been an anonymous source in any news matters related to the Trump investigation or the Clinton investigation. He further testified in response to questioning from the chairman that he had not ever authorized someone else at the FBI to be an anonymous source in news reports about the Trump investigation or the Clinton administration. He answered simply and categorically no. Now, in contrast to that, former Deputy Director McCabe has stated that Director Comey was aware of his leaking to the press. Moreover, his lawyer says he has email records that demonstrated Director Comey was aware of his leaking to the press all during the time it was happening. Both of their statements cannot be true. It is not possible, logically, for Director Comey to be telling the truth and for former Deputy Director McCabe to be telling the truth. So, Director Wray, tell us, which one is telling the truth to the best of your knowledge?
Senator, unfortunately, I can't answer that question because of an ongoing matter.
Is the FBI in possession of the emails referred to by Mr. McCabe of the Deputy Director being aware of and authorizing leaks to the press?
The same answer, unfortunately.
Let me ask you, Mr. Gray, how seriously would the FBI treat the matter of the Director of the FBI perjuring himself before the Senate Judiciary Committee?
Well, Senator, as the current Director of the FBI testifying before the Senate Judiciary Committee, I take the obligation to tell the truth extremely seriously, and I would expect our organization to do so as well.
Well, I would hope you would take as seriously the fidelity to law of prior directors. and one or the other is not telling the truth. I don't know which one is telling the truth and which one is lying, but if there are email indicia that either demonstrate Deputy Director McCabe was telling the truth or Director Comey was telling the truth, this committee and the American people need to know. And simply saying an ongoing investigation means we'll never know who lied to this committee. That's not acceptable, I believe, either to this committee or to the American people.
Well, Senator, one of the central takeaways from the Inspector General's report that's at issue today is the importance of following long-established norms in the department, which includes commenting on pending matters in front of Congress or otherwise publicly. And so I don't believe that it would be appropriate for me, no matter how tempted I might be to answer your question, to deviate from those norms in one of my first acts as director.
Director Wray, let me understand which pending matter you're referring to. The Clinton email matter is closed, is that correct?
Yes.
There's no allegation that this is under the scope of the special counsel. This has nothing to do with Russia collusion or anything else. This is a question of did the director of the FBI perjure himself to this committee? That's not within Special Counsel Mueller's jurisdiction, is it?
Whether the director of the FBI, I don't know what's fully within the scope of Special Counsel.
Well, you're declining to answer a question because you say there's an ongoing investigation.
And I can't.
I'm trying to understand what investigation arguably covers the emails demonstrating whether or not the director of the FBI committed perjury.
And I can't answer that question without describing an ongoing investigation.
So it's your position you're not going to describe any investigation, but you'll decline to answer any questions because there might be some investigation that might implicate it?
No, what I'm testifying to is that the questions you're asking, I know for a fact, implicate matters that I can't describe without implicating an ongoing investigation.
All right, let's shift to Mr. Horowitz. Let's go a little bit deeper into the issue you brought up with Senator Coons about the potential of bias in the investigation. Your conclusion was that the agents involved in the conduct, quote, brought discredit to themselves, sowed doubt about the FBI's handling of the investigation, and impacted the reputation of the FBI. There were approximately 15 full-time agents and analysts staffed on this investigation. Is that correct?
I don't, as I sit here, I'm not sure the exact number. It could well have been that number. It was a lot and probably around that number.
And Deputy Assistant Director Peter Strzok was assigned to the investigation in August of 2015 and was placed in charge of supervising the day-to-day operations.
My understanding is he was, in essence, leading the investigation.
So the agent leading the investigation, is it true that during the period of the investigation in late 2015 and in 2016, when Mr. Strzok was in charge, he used an FBI device to call President Trump a, quote, effing idiot, although I don't believe he abbreviated it, a loathsome human, and a disaster?
Correct.
Did he also say multiple times that Donald Trump, quote, cannot be president?
Correct.
And on August 6, 2016, when FBI counsel Lisa Page said to Strzok that, quote, maybe you're meant to stay where you are because you're meant to protect the country from that menace, meaning President Trump, did Mr. Strzok reply that I can protect our country at many levels?
He did.
And 2 days later, when counsel Lisa Page asked Mr. Strzok whether Donald Trump would ever become president, did Strzok reply, quote, no, he's not, we'll stop it?
Correct.
And is it true that there are many similar statements by Mr. Strzok in the report?
That's correct. And indeed, you could go on to August 15, 7 days later, which was of concern to us as well, referencing an insurance policy.
Now, according to the report, beyond Mr. Strzok and Lisa Page, there were at least 3 other FBI employees involved in the Hillary Clinton email investigation that showed animus. For example, they called President Trump an effing idiot, again, and they called his supporters a slur for the intellectually disabled that I won't repeat in this committee. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Does any of that conduct give one confidence in fairness or impartiality in the enforcement of justice?
I think it undercuts confidence precisely as we said.
Now, you referred to former Congressman Anthony Weiner's seized laptop. It's correct that the FBI discovered the presence of thousands of emails related to the Clinton investigation on September 27th, 2016. How long did Deputy Director McCabe and Director Comey know about the emails that were potentially relevant to the Clinton administration and do absolutely nothing about it?
So Deputy Director McCabe was aware on September 28th, the next day, and was notified on multiple ways and multiple occasions, as well on September 29. There was follow-up about that by Strzok and others, and between September 29 and October 24 or 25, there was no activity by the mid-year team or FBI headquarters, and in fact, it was only reinstigated on October 21 when the New York field office went to the Southern District of New York and said, no one's doing anything about this.
So nearly a month.
Nearly a month.
Thank you, Mr. Horowitz.
And I'll just to clarify
Please.
also, if I could, it's unclear exactly what and when Director Comey knew, because there is testimony from Deputy Director McCabe, that he briefed him on it somewhere in that late September, early October time period, but he also referred to it as a flyby briefing. And I think in an area like this, you need to be careful, as I'm guessing Director Wray could testify to. When you're managing 37,000 people, it's unclear whether it's fair to hold someone accountable in that position if they only got a flyby briefing. So that's why I'm hesitant to speak on that.
Thank you.
I think you folks can be out of here in 5 minutes. First of all, I'd like to introduce a chronology of events about the Clinton investigation and background documents into the record to supplement the Inspector General's report without objection. So ordered. I have just one short question for Mr. Wray. Mr. McCabe's attorney said that he can't turn over certain emails, the same emails mentioned by Senator Cruz, because he doesn't have them and because of a non-disclosure agreement. We have a copy of that agreement, and it does not contain legally required language to notify the employee of exceptions that protect disclosures to Congress and others. I also wrote you about this on June 5, and I don't have an answer either, and I think you'll probably tell me I get an answer. I was going to ask you when the FBI is going to respond to my oversight request, but I know you'll work on that. I have great confidence you can help us get that information. So, have you informed Mr. McCabe that he is allowed to provide information to Congress, and what steps have you taken to make sure your non-disclosure agreements comply with the law?
So, Senator, I'm not sure that, Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure I'm aware of all the specifics of the various back and forth on the non-disclosure agreement involving Deputy Director McCabe. The last I had heard, there was one issue related to this issue, the non-disclosure agreement, that I thought had been resolved. But I also understand there may be some follow-up, and I'm going to need to look into that. I would expect that we would make sure that our agreement is, fully compliant with all the applicable laws. My understanding was that it is, but we will take a hard look to make sure that it is.
Then can you respond to that in writing for me?
Absolutely.
Or part of the letter that the information that I requested?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
So the record will stay open for a week. A lot of members will have follow-up questions, I'm sure. And I've got a closing statement I'm not going to read. I'll put it in the record. Thank you all for your cooperation. Meeting adjourned.